You know, every day here on the Thom Hartmann Program, Louise and I and our team, Sean, Nate, Shira, Dave, Chase, Sue, Nigel, Ron, we all work to put together the very, very best show we possibly can. And there's an enormous amount of work that goes into the show. And one of the things that comes out of that is a lot of content, a lot of specific information that we go through and we dig out and, you know, we want to share with you. And Sue puts that into our newsletter every week. And I think you will, if you don't already receive our newsletter, it comes in email every day, about an hour after we're off the air, or maybe a couple hours after we're off the air. And Sue goes through and pulls literally every link to every story that we talked about and puts it into the newsletter. It's free. We don't sell a list or anything. You complete safety and security. There's no charge. There's no nothing. Just, plug in your email address over at thomhartmann.com, and you get signed up for the newsletter. It's all fairly obvious. You'll see it on the website. So check it out, thomhartmann.com. Thank you. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Unequal Protection, How Corporations Became People and How You Can Fight Back by Thom Hartmann. This is from the introduction titled The Battle to Save Democracy. Excuse me. On September 2nd, 2009, the transnational pharmaceutical giant Pfizer pled guilty to multiple criminal felonies. It had been marketing drugs in a way that may well have led to the deaths of people, and that definitely led physicians to prescribe and patients to use pharmaceuticals in a way that for which they were not intended. Because Pfizer is a corporation, a legal abstraction, really, it couldn't go to jail like fraudster Bernie Madoff or killer John Dillinger. Instead, it paid a $1.2 billion criminal fine to the U.S. government, the biggest in history, as well as an additional $1 billion in civil penalties. The total settlement was more than $2.3 billion, another record. None of Pfizer's executives, decision makers, stockholders, owners, or employees saw even 5 minutes of the inside of a police station or a jail. Most Americans don't even know about this huge and massive crime, nor do they know that the criminal never spent a day in jail. But they do know that in the autumn of 2004, Martha Stewart was convicted of lying to investigators about her sale of stock in another pharmaceutical company. Her crime cost nobody their life, but she famously was escorted off to a women's prison. Had she been a corporation instead of a human being, odds are there would not have even been an investigation. Yet over the past century, and particularly the past 40 years, corporations have repeatedly asserted that they are, in fact, persons, and therefore eligible for the human rights protections of the Bill of Rights. In 2009, the right-wing advocacy group Citizens United argued before the Supreme Court that they had the First Amendment right to free speech and to influence elections through the production and distribution of a slasher documentary designed to destroy Hillary Clinton's ability to win the Democratic nomination. Some political observers assert that they did this in part because they believed that a black man whose first name sounded like Osama and whose middle name was Hussein could never, ever possibly win against a Republican, no matter how poor a candidate they put up. In that, they were following on a 2003 case before the Supreme Court in which Nike claimed it had the First Amendment right to lie in its corporate marketing, a variation of the First Amendment right of free speech. Corporations haven't limited their grasp to the First Amendment. Pretty much any and virtually every amendment that could be used to further corporate interests has been fair game. As you'll learn in this book, in previous decades, a chemical company took to the Supreme Court a case asserting its Fourth Amendment right to privacy from the EPA, snooping into its illegal chemical discharges. Other corporations have asserted Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination, as well as asserting the 14th Amendment, passed after the Civil War to strip slavery from the Constitution, asserting that it protects their right against discrimination by a local community that doesn't want them building a toxic waste incinerator, commercial hog operations, or superstores. If this trend continues, it's probably just a matter of time before a corporation claims the Second Amendment right to bear arms anywhere, anytime, and your credit card company's bill collector shows up at your home with a sidearm. This legal situation is not only bizarre, but also quite the opposite of the visions for this country held by the founders of the nation and the framers of the Constitution. They were sufficiently worried about corporate power that they didn't even include in the Constitution the word corporation, intending instead that the states should tightly regulate corporate behavior, which the states did quite well until just after the Civil War. The American Revolution, you'll learn in this book, was in fact provoked by the misbehavior of a British corporation. Our nation was founded in an anti-corporate power fury. The most significant and oft-quoted precedent of the turning point of corporate power in America began just after the Civil War. It rested on a constitutional amendment successfully written and passed by a group of radical Republicans after the Civil War. That's what they called themselves, radical Republicans, to take slavery out of the Constitution. Given that today's Republican Party has, largely since the robber baron era of the 1880s, been the party of big business and the very rich, it's a bit difficult for some people to get their minds around the possibility that the Republican Party started out as a reform party, that for nearly 70 years, from before Abraham Lincoln until just after Theodore Roosevelt left the party to start a third party, had a strong progressive wing. But the Republican Party did. Although Lincoln was, by today's standards, a moderate Republican, he was still anti-slavery, pro-middle class, and pro-labor. In fact, he famously said labor is superior to capital because it precedes capital. Nobody has wealth until somebody makes something. And he was the first president both to use the word strike in public and to actually stop police and private armies from killing and beating strikers. And just like in today's mainstream Democratic Party, where there's a progressive minority that always seems to be pushing the edges, in the Republican Party of the 1800s, there was a very, even by today's standards, progressive faction. The radical Republicans were a splinter group that emerged in a big way from the Republican Party at its founding in 1854. And just after the Civil War in 1866, they gained a majority among Republicans in the House of Representatives, where they had a powerful influence until the faction disintegrated in the 1870s during the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. They supported the absolute right of freed slaves to vote and participate in government. It goes on from there. Unequal protection, corporate power.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Today is your turn. Yesterday was Robert Mueller's turn. Yesterday was Congress's turn to ask questions of Robert Mueller in front of the Judiciary Committee, in front of the House Intelligence Committee. Yesterday was their turn. Today is your turn. It's processing day. Robert Mueller testified yesterday. What did we learn? What did it remind you of? What should people be paying attention to now? Yeah, we have the question, what impact did it have? We had the question of what should happen next. But not just the horse race, not just the optics, not just the wrestling match, not just commenting like sports announcers, adding color and predictions to some game. But what should we be reminded with respect to the substance of our democracy? Not just the veneer, but the substance. What did it teach us? What did it remind us of? What should it remind us of? The call-in number is 202-808-9925. 202-808-9925. My name is Jefferson Smith. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I am honored to sit in. This is your show, and today is your turn. Some of my thoughts were covered eloquently, if only coincidentally, or perhaps because I was reminded, by Adam Schiff. So as y'all queue up, as y'all call that number, 202-808-9925, here is Adam Schiff.
At the outset, and on behalf of my colleagues, I want to thank you, Special Counsel Mueller, for a lifetime of service to the country. Your report, for those who have taken the time to study it, is methodical and it is devastating. For it tells the story of a foreign adversary's sweeping and systematic intervention in a close U.S. presidential election. That should be enough to deserve the attention of every American, as you well point out. But your report tells another story as well. The story of the 2016 election is also a story about disloyalty to country, about greed, and about lies. Your investigation determined that the Trump campaign, including Donald Trump himself, knew that a foreign power was intervening in our election and welcomed it, built Russian meddling into their strategy, and used it. Disloyalty to country. Those are strong words, but how else are we to describe a presidential campaign which did not inform the authorities of a foreign offer of dirt on their opponent, which did not publicly shun it or turn it away, but which instead invited it, encouraged it, and made full use of it? That disloyalty may not have been criminal. Constrained by uncooperative witnesses, the destruction of documents, and the use of encrypted communications, your team was not able to establish each of the elements of the crime of conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt. so not a provable crime in any event. But I think maybe something worse. A crime is the violation of law written by Congress. But disloyalty to country violates the very oath of citizenship, our devotion to a core principle on which our nation was founded, that we, the people, and not some foreign power that wishes us ill, we decide who governs us. This is also a story about money, about greed and corruption, about the leadership of a campaign willing to compromise the nation's interest, not only to win, but to make money at the same time. About a campaign chairman indebted to pro-Russian interests who tried to use his position to clear his debts and make millions. About a national security advisor using his position to make money from still other foreign interests. And about a candidate trying to make more money than all of them put together through a real estate project that to him was worth a fortune, hundreds of millions of dollars, and the realization of a lifelong ambition, a Trump Tower in the heart of Moscow. A candidate who, in fact, viewed his whole campaign as the greatest infomercial in history. Donald Trump and his senior staff were not alone in their desire to use the election to make money. For Russia, too, there was a powerful financial motive. Putin wanted relief from U.S. economic sanctions imposed in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and over human rights violations. The secret Trump Tower meeting between the Russians and senior campaign officials was about sanctions. The secret conversations between Flynn and the Russian ambassador were about sanctions. Trump and his team wanted more money for themselves, and the Russians wanted more money for themselves and for their oligarchs. But the story doesn't end here either. For your report also tells a story about lies. Lots of lies. Lies about a gleaming tower in Moscow and lies about talks with the Kremlin. Lies about the firing of FBI Director James Comey and lies about efforts to fire you, Director Mueller, and lies to cover it up. Lies about secret negotiations with the Russians over sanctions and lies about WikiLeaks. Lies about polling data and lies about hush money payments. Lies about meetings in the Seychelles to set up secret back channels and lies about a secret meeting in New York Trump Tower. Lies to the FBI, lies to your staff, and lies to this committee. Lies to obstruct an investigation into the most serious attack on our democracy by a foreign power in our history. That is where your report ends, Director Mueller, with a scheme to cover up, obstruct, and deceive every bit as systematic and pervasive as the Russian disinformation campaign itself, but far more pernicious since this rot came from within. Even now, after 448 pages and 2 volumes, the deception continues. The president and his acolytes say your report found no collusion, though your report explicitly declined to address that question, since collusion can involve both criminal and non-criminal conduct. Your report laid out multiple offers of Russian help to the Trump campaign, the campaign's acceptance of that help, and overt acts in furtherance of Russian help. To most Americans, that is the very definition of collusion, whether it is a crime or not. They say your report found no evidence of obstruction, though you outline numerous actions by the president intended to obstruct the investigation. They say the president has been fully exonerated, though you specifically declare you could not exonerate him. In fact, they say your whole investigation was nothing more than a witch hunt, that the Russians didn't interfere in our election, that it's all a terrible hoax. The real crime, they say, is not that the Russians intervened to help Donald Trump, but that the FBI had the temerity to investigate it when they did. But worst of all, worse than all the lies and the greed, is the disloyalty to country.
There.
For that too continues.
That's Adam Schiff. When we come back from the break, we're going to be taking your calls. Now, there has been lots of consternation, lots of discussion about the performance of Robert Mueller. As I said yesterday, and as I will say as many times as I am given the opportunity, think one of history's great mistakes, and one of the media's great mistakes, was calling this the Mueller investigation, calling this the Mueller report, putting the focus on someone who was not the subject of the investigation, someone whose job was supposed to be over, someone who was not talking to the press, someone whose answers were so circumspect they were never really going to be an effective focal point, but perhaps whose mystery dazzled us. But that dazzlement is not what was needed. What was needed is gathering the truth. Let's talk about what truth we were reminded of yesterday, and we're back. This is Thom Hartmann's show. I'm Jeff Smith. Thanks for being here.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
The number's 202-808-9925. This is Thom Hartmann's show. I'm Jefferson Smith. Bill from, I think it's Mico, Florida. You're on the air.
Yeah, good afternoon, Jefferson. It seems to me that the whole campaign scenario, and it's like a child, it's like a kid with a dirty diaper that keeps on crying. And, we don't change the diaper. And that's...
You just got really muffled, Bill. I can't hear you now. I think you're still talking, but I can't hear you.
Yeah, it's like
a kid with a dirty diaper who keeps on crying. How is it like a kid with a dirty diaper who keeps on crying?
With the voter suppression and with Trump's denial and the lack of the Republicans doing anything about the voter suppression and the campaign contributions, which is preempting the middle class in this country. And it's just a terrible situation.
So who's the kid in this scenario, and what's the dirty diaper?
The dirty diaper is the campaign contribution system, the cover-up, and
And who's the kid that's crying, Bill?
The American people.
All right.
All right, thanks.
Appreciate the call.
All right, guy.
Elizabeth from Lowell, Massachusetts. How you doing in Lowell?
Very frustrated at what happened yesterday at these meetings.
Say more.
I just think the Democrats are so naive to put all of your hope on one man is ridiculous. Mm-hmm. I mean, why they thought this report was going to solve everything. I just think they keep getting hit by the Republicans, and they're not fighting back. I'm very disappointed in the Democratic Party.
Well, so let's pause there.
I've been a Democrat all my life, and I'm 73, retired, and they just are not delivering.
So let's pause there for a second.
Yes.
When you say when they put all their hopes into and you're not alone in that perspective, right? I mean, that was Michael Moore's take. In fact, Michael Moore tweeted that, and then Donald Trump retweeted it, and then was start getting criticized and saying, hey, if you're getting retweeted by President Trump, that if you're getting retweeted by this president, you're losing, you're doing it wrong. And this argument that the Democrats are failing by relying too much on Mueller, you're not the only one who says that. But what does that mean to you? When you say they're relying too much on Mueller, how does that manifest itself, that they're relying too much on it?
It manifests itself by not doing anything else, like guaranteeing the ballot box for voters. Nobody is confident in that their vote is being registered correctly. If they're doing anything about it, they're not letting the general public know. There you go. And
Elizabeth from Lowell, thank you so much. And let me reply to that, because this is, I will acknowledge, as a hobby horse for me, or this is a. So is it a peeve? Is it a trigger? I'm not sure if it's a peeve or a trigger or some other word. But very often, I would offer this. So first of all, I have been saying for a while that I agree with you that any of us who rely too much on this former Republican, non-Nazi hunter, institutionalist to save the republic, I think are relying too much on that. But I would say that the thing we have to rely on is not merely some political party, but is us and changing the systems of governance. And I'll talk more about that after this. You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith. I'm honored to be here. It's your chance. It's processing day. We are looking back at yesterday, and not just yesterday, but asking the question, what did we learn? What were we reminded of? In the break, we got a question where Elizabeth from Lowell, Massachusetts asked, why are the Democrats so fixated on Mueller that the Democrats were letting the country down by relying so much on him and not, for instance, focusing on issues like guaranteeing the ballot box. Now, we are going to talk today to a witness, I'm going to call him a witness, about the efforts in the legislature, the efforts in the Congress to protect the ballot and what's happening to those. And I see this dynamic, and I think it's a dynamic that needs to change. Now, I'm going to first agree and then offer my quibble. I'm going to agree that there has been too much faith, I would say too much attention by the media on Robert Mueller. I opened by saying we called the investigation the wrong thing. You could have called it any number of 10 other things. Russiagate, the corruption investigation, the Trump investigation, the Trump hearings, the Trump corruption report. Any number of things. You could call in the number and offer your own name of what you think this investigation should be called. By calling it the Mueller report, I think we did collectively, as a polity, as a zeitgeist, as a public conversation, put too much attention, too much focus on what was not the object of the investigation. In some respects, not the subject or the object of the investigation. It was an observer. It was an investigator, rather than the thing that was really at issue, the thing that was supposed to be investigated. So couldn't agree more about that. And even as the tweet from Michael Moore yesterday said that criticized the hearing and criticized Robert Mueller, and that I can agree with that portion of it. And I'm sure some of you are feeling that way. But there's another piece that I don't want to agree with, that I do want to quibble with. And that is that somehow this is a failure of the opposition party. This is primarily sits at the feet of Democrats. Well, Democrats let us down, or Democrats aren't getting the message out there. And very often, that's what people say. Like, what are we missing? What are Democrats failing to do? And they say, oh, well, they need to guarantee the ballot. They need to make sure that we stop interference on the elections. Well, there are bills. The House can pass these bills. The Republican Senate will not pass these bills. That is not at the feet of the opposition party. That is not at the feet of Nancy Pelosi. That is not at the feet of Chuck Schumer. That is not at the feet of the Democratic National Committee. That is not at the feet of any portion of the opposition party apparatus. And then the other critique is, well, I wish we would be knowing about these things. I wish they would tell us about these opposition efforts. Why aren't they saying something? I can't tell you how many times I have heard in speeches, in House parties, in town hall meetings, on the radio, in emails, why aren't Democrats standing up? And this feeling of people who've been lifelong Democratic voters, who are resisting now, who are part of the opposition party or at least the opposition movement. We're wondering, why aren't Democrats standing up? Why can't we hear them? And I will say that, too, is not merely at the feet of the opposition party. That is not merely at the feet of elected representatives. Now, I have my quibbles. They spend too much of their time raising money. Is that at their feet? Partly, but it's also partly the fact that we have unlimited campaign funds in this country, unlimited campaign budgets in this country, and unlimited secret money contributions allowed by this Supreme Court. And so that's sort of justifiable, or at least almost necessary. It seems necessary to many members of Congress to spend all that time. So they have some quibbles with how they spend their time. But ultimately, it is not the Democratic National Committee, it is not the Congress who gets to decide what the media is talking about. That is the media apparatus. That's why you who listen to this program are so important. That's why I so appreciate being able to spend this time. That's why what Tom does is so important. That's why what Free Speech TV does is so important. So that there is an apparatus to talk about this stuff. So when we are offering our critiques, I would just, my own note is that we put our anger, that we put our criticism where it truly belongs and where it best belongs. That's not to say the opposition party bears no criticism, but think about who bears it the most. Let's hear quickly from Pam from Chicago. Pam, you're on the air.
Hi, Jefferson. How are you?
I am well. It's good to hear your voice.
If you would allow me, I'm well. If you would allow me just to say right on to the citizens, the people of Puerto Rico, they got it done. And that's how you get results. There will be no order until you're out of office. So I am so glad that they did what they had to do and they got the result that they wanted for now. Now it's a matter of getting the right administration in there. So I'm so happy for them.
And Pam, thank you for bringing that up. We do need to talk about that today. And I think you flagged the key issue, which is a little bit like the Arab Spring. Toppling a regime is one thing, building a system of governance is another. So I think a lot of the important questions are still to come, but it's at least a reminder of the power of the citizenry to have an impact on their government. And that at least should be inspiring for people who are wondering about whether they should get engaged in governance. But anyway, go ahead.
Exactly. So quickly with the Mueller report, and I agree with you. We should have another name for it. And for me and those in my circle, we didn't put all our eggs in this basket, but we wanted this hearing because there were some things that were brought out that maybe you really couldn't capture if you read the report or you couldn't read it at all. I loved Adam Schiff. I guess the way he closed, he said Trump is disloyal. He said, and Trump is wrong. And it is not patriotic to do what he's done. And
that's the music that's wrapping us. You can finish your thought, and then we're going to break.
Sure. And for Mueller, let's have some respect for our elders. I have no problem with the way he purported himself at that hearing.
Pam, I appreciate you making that point. Any talk about, there was so much of the commentary that basically boiled down to Mueller looked old. You know what? So it's a huge portion of our population and some of the most wise people in our population. Thank you, Pam.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We're going to be back right after this. The call-in number 202-808-9925. What did we learn? What were we reminded of?
Our book for today on the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Kingdom of Lies, Unnerving Adventures in the World of Cybercrime by Kate Fazzini. This is from the preface. It didn't take me long in my career as a cybersecurity executive to figure out everyone was lying to me. The biggest lie of all came at the very beginning, that cybersecurity is hard, too hard, certainly too difficult for someone who lacks years and years of deep technical training. That is no place for writers. That thicket of incomprehensible jargon alone seemed meant to discourage outsiders like me from entering the field. They told me I could never hope to understand the terminology unless I'd worked around it for a very long time, unless I had a special and complicated certification, unless I knew how to take apart and reassemble a computer, unless I knew how to code in Python and could read it, interpret it, and spot problems on sight. And if I somehow managed to learn the lingo, the learning curve for the rest of it would prove insurmountable. Lies, lies, lies. It's unfortunate because there's a huge gap between the demand for cybersecurity workers and the people available to fill those jobs. I think one of the reasons for that is because people can't imagine themselves doing this kind of work. Can you use a smartphone, make a PowerPoint, think on your feet, ever organize a night out to the movies with your friends that went well and nobody crashed their car to or from the event? Welcome to the 21st century's hottest career path. Are you able to charm the pants off women? Did you escape an abusive marriage? Have you ever hosted a toddler's birthday party at your home? Honey, I want you on my cybersecurity team. After reading the stories in this book, you will understand that what makes cybersecurity complicated is the complexity of human beings. So if you know how to deal with people, you can handle internet security. If you understand what makes people tick, not only will you be able to recognize a threat, you'll be one step ahead of your adversary. During my career as a cybersecurity executive at multinational corporations, a journalist for Wall Street Journal and later CNBC, and a professor at Georgetown University, I've met a lot of fascinating people. From the hackers who perpetrate malicious attacks to the security professionals who try to prevent these incidents from happening, and the alphabet soup of government agencies that do damage control. At the end of the day, they're all fathers, sons, mothers, sisters, and spouses. In other words, people just like us. Yes, the white hats cross paths with black hats and change alliances more frequently than you might expect, but they're driven by the same desires as the rest of us, even if sometimes it feels as if everyone in cybersecurity is allergic to the truth. As a professional, I was told a great many lies about the field I've grown to love so much. After becoming a journalist on the cybersecurity beat, I was told even more. Here are a few. Let me introduce you to the hacker community. This lie is usually delivered with a wink and a nod from someone who thinks they know every hacker on the planet. The truth of the matter is there is no hacker community. Sure, the guys who make a splash at the big annual conferences might say otherwise, but every country, every state, every faction, every identifying group has its own community of people who hack computers. Some of them are extremely conservative. Others are massively liberal. Some fall in between. Some wear suits and ties and work as lawyers during the day, while others look like everyday citizens and have great people skills as they pursue the idiosyncratic agendas. Some are good guys who got fed up with low pay and boring duties and became criminals. Some are criminals who ended up being good guys. Many start and end their careers on either end of that spectrum. Some, including many you'll meet in this book, are extremely proficient hackers who have no time or inclination to identify with any community at all. As a journalist, I was astonished at the number of people who came out of the woodwork to offer me exclusive access to the hacker community. I couldn't help but notice that the members of the source's hacker community were often people just like him or her. My point is there are many different types of people working in this field, and I can guarantee you that a lot of them are exactly like you. Here's another lie. He's a luminary in the cybersecurity field. He's probably not. Fame and luminescence don't typically intersect in this field. The people I've met who are actual geniuses aren't famous, and most of them don't have social media profiles. They tend not to pontificate on areas outside their expertise. The people who are constantly headlining conferences and who are so often offered up to me for interviews have less insight than those who stay underground. Anything a high-profile hacker is willing to share typically carries with it a massive and crystal clear agenda that I've learned to spot from a mile away. Even if a conversation is off the record, the intel coming from a top government official or other marquee corporate cybersecurity name carries little novel information. The only people who have illuminated the way for me in this world, and in this book, have been genuine practitioners who never held a C-level title. You've never heard of them, and because I've changed their names to protect their privacy, you probably never will. They are luminaries not because of the degrees they've collected or the events they've headlined, but because they carry a lantern that guides the path for others. These types of people typically don't have a public relations team. One of my favorite lies, he doesn't know what he's talking about. This one is usually delivered by someone who asserts that he or she knows the cybersecurity field better than anyone else. These people will brag that they know what it's like to be a hacker and can do things that no one else in the room can do. I'm always wary of those who try to establish their bona fides by discrediting the expertise of other cybersecurity professionals. The depth and breadth of this field is so vast that anyone who works in it is an expert at some part of it. And I have yet to meet someone who is an expert at all of it, not even close. Every view of an incident is informed by the reviewer, what he sees, what her level of expertise is, and that changes over time. It's like asking someone who lives in the Plaza to describe Manhattan. The book is Kingdom of Lies by Kate Fazzini.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
What were some of the takeaways from yesterday? We will be talking about Puerto Rico a little bit today. We'll be talking about, we're also going to be talking about the substance of governance today, including in the third hour, what's happening with the Defense Department and making sure that we don't only focus on the one major event. But this is a processing day. This is a chance. Well, yesterday, a bunch of you called. We appreciated those calls. We were able to take a few of them, but mostly we're going with the report itself, going with the testimony, the questioning, the hearing itself. Today is your chance to offer your thoughts. And particularly, what did we learn and what were we reminded of? Senator Mazie Hirono was reminded of three things. Her comment, three things are clear from Mueller today so far. 1, no exoneration. 2, overwhelming evidence of obstruction. 3, the OLC memo prevented Mueller from indicting Trump. She then renewed her call for impeachment. Seth Kotler, who's a friend of the show, has been on before. Democratic members of Congress today showed they've done their homework. They came equipped with chapter and verse references. The Republicans, on the other hand, did their homework by watching Hannity and Judge Jeanine. What are your thoughts? The call-in number is 202-808-9925. You can also tweet at us at Thom Hartmann or at me. I'm Jefferson D. Smith. Let's go straight to your call. Let's go to Shirley, who's been watching on YouTube. Hello, Shirley.
Hello. I would like to comment on the format the Democrats used yesterday. I thought it treated Mr. Mueller very unfairly.
Say more.
Well, they would ask him a question and tell him where in the report it was. While he was trying to find his place, they'd say, well, we'll just go on to the next question. And then they never gave him an opportunity to answer. They never considered that each person went to a different section of the report, and he had to regroup each time he had a new person talking to him. I think it would have been much more effective had each one of them asked him one substantial question and given him 4.5 minutes to answer. It was like the debates. I think the debates are totally useless. They're nothing but a shouting match. You can't have a substantial discussion in a minute. And I just think it made him uncomfortable. It made him look like he wasn't all there, which I think I'm 80. I couldn't have done what they were trying to make him do. I mean, I think they created a fiasco yesterday.
So thank you, Shirley, for calling. From my read, I saw a few different dynamics. One of them was that you mentioned, were the time limits, that each of them had very limited time. My quickest reply is I think if they had done that, if they just asked one question and had Mueller talk for 4.5 minutes, he wouldn't have talked for 4.5 minutes. One of the biggest challenges they were facing was not just, and I will concede the point, that if what we were looking for yesterday was primarily a reality TV show that was well produced to dazzle us and pick a new bachelor, yesterday was not scripted to do that. I agree. And for those who thought, the book of the Mueller report isn't enough, we need the movie, I will agree that the movie was not made by Michael Bay, which is one of the reasons I want to ask about substance. I want to hear about substance. But in terms of the format, I had a few format ideas. So for one thing, I think a major challenge, not only time limits, 5 minutes per member, but also that if they had asked an open-ended question of Mueller, mostly all he said, and I think the count was 200 times, he answered a question by essentially not offering anything to the question. That he did offer some yeses and nos. That when Nadler was saying it's true that Trump wouldn't testify, right? You really wanted him to testify, right? He was material to the case, right? You had repeatedly asked him, right? And he said, correct, to each of those. That did move some units. That did work. It was almost like working with a hostile witness in a cross-examination. It was almost like yes or no questions got you answers, but open-ended questions didn't get you much. Open-ended questions just get you, well, I'll refer you to the report. That could be a critique on Mueller. That could also be a critique on the format. Here's a format idea. A format idea that I would have loved to see, but it didn't occur to me until too late, so I don't want to throw too many stones. And also, hat tip to Rachel Maddow, who came up with, I think, essentially an identical idea, which is have a panel, have the investigators So when you have a question, they are ready, the person who has the direct information, not just the figurehead, not just the overseer of the investigation, but each of the people who wrote the chapters and verse who are ready to answer chapter and verse. We might still see that. So that's a little bit of it. And I do think it would have taken a skillful questioner and somebody who was motivated to provide additional information to make that format provide more electricity. But I do still think if we were paying attention, there were some moments that should have given us some electricity. Let's hear from Paul from WCPT in, I think it's Woodinville, Washington. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, Robert Mueller did and responded exactly the way I expected he would. I mean, he was even-handed to both sides. A good example of that is he declined to answer about equally in terms of elaborating on various questions to both Republicans and Democrats.
Yep.
He was not there to tilt the board one way or another. Yet I must say that perhaps both sides, but far more on the Republican side, they were there to try and discredit him, to try and confuse him. And as the previous scholar said, I mean, let's look at this. This is 428 pages. Now, for perspective, the book Moby Dick is about the same length. It's over 125,000 words, which, as you pointed out, he did not write all himself. So asking him to refer quickly to this and quickly to that and then say you were inconsistent here and you were inconsistent there is really ridiculous, especially when he's trying to clarify in these short-term questions. But, I mean, if anything, if the Republicans are going to say that Robert Mueller is not credible and the investigation was partisan, let's see what that means. In March, the report came out, and Donald Trump was waving his hands around, I'm exonerated. No obstruction, no collusion. He said, I'm exonerated, yet that creep from Ohio yesterday said, oh, exonerated is not a legal term, and you said collusion's not a legal term. They got all nitpicky like they were trying to get Trump off on a technicality. And so if they're trying to impede or impeach Mueller's credibility, then they just took away their own, what Trump was saying to begin with. You can't have it both ways. And that's what they tried to do, and tried to make him look like some confused, senile, fuddy-duddy old man by asking him questions. A lot of their questions were alleged facts and interjected circumstances which were outside the scope of the report.
Paul, let me interject for a moment. Was there anything, in addition to sort of the theater of whether it's Mueller's performance or the performance of the questioners, the performance of the Republicans, anything on the substance that you were reminded of that you had forgotten, either that had happened, that had appeared in the media, or something that was new to you? Anything on the substance that was a takeaway for you?
Let's go to the idea in media is to don't bury the lead. Nobody contested the fact that Russia interfered in our 2016 American election, yet what has Donald Trump done about it? Nothing. He has not said boo to it, no sanctions, no nothing, yet he threatens Iran with sanctions and military action. He threatens Venezuela with sanctions and military action. What has he threatened with Russia? Nothing. Yet nobody disagrees that Russia interfered. He has not said a thing about it. That's the elephant in the living room.
Thank you for that. And my own, something else that occurred to me afterwards. Mueller did come a little more alive in the latter portion of the hearings, in the latter portion, in fact, of the Intelligence Committee hearings, talking about Russian interference, when he said that it was problematic, when he said that the Russians are at it right now. If I had to do it over again, I actually said this, I would have flipped them. I would have done the Intelligence Committee hearing first and the Judiciary Committee hearing second. In part because very often, when you're interviewing somebody, if you can talk about the stuff that they care about early, it'll bring them more alive. It'll get them more energy. It'll get them engaged with the conversation. That's a production tip as much as anything, and I don't want to merely focus on the production of the thing. So many of us are becoming. I mean, Hartmann says it every day, right? Tom says it just about every day. The democracy is not a spectator sport, and I want to avoid myself falling into the trap of treating this as a spectator activity. But I appreciated your comment about not bearing the lead, that this should not be merely about the current president of the United States. It should not be merely about one person. It should be about the sanctity of our elections, our responsibility to preserve the sanctity of our elections, and that should be something that is a transpartisan issue. That should be a 70%, 80%, 90% support issue. And by the way, pretty much is, but that's not reflected by the actions of Congress, or more specifically, that is not reflected by the actions of the Republicans in Congress, by Mitch McConnell killing any bill that would preserve the sanctity of our elections. That is vastly more important about than whether or not Robert Mueller sounded like a 74-year-old or something a little older or something a little younger, whether or not that matters or not. The sanctity of our elections matters vastly more. We have time for one. No, we don't have time for one more call, except we will right after this break. I'm Jefferson Smith. You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. We appreciate you doing it. We're going to come back with some calls. We've got calls including about comments about some of the substance on some of the answers, including a question about Trump's tax return. That was a question Mueller wouldn't answer. He offered no comment about whether or not they had seen the tax return. If the money was in the banana stand, we know there are facts in the tax returns. We'll be back. This is Tom's show. I'm Jeff.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
You are listening to Thom Hartmann. Sort of. 202-808-9925. Mary from Salamanca. How you doing?
I'm doing just fine today. It's beautiful out, and it's quiet, and it doesn't seem to have to be a care in the world. I live right next to Allegheny State Park, but I'm very concerned about the health of our country.
Yeah.
I listened to the Mueller, Mr. Mueller speaking. And by the way, that Shifton person, his speech, his opening remarks were just music to my ears.
Yeah.
He was so eloquent, but simple, so that the average person could understand. But I am very deeply concerned about how the interview was conducted. It was like one of those speed dialing jobs. I just think that Mr. Mueller was just overwhelmed by the questions, and then he had to scamper about for the page and the clause and the numbers, and it got me confused because I didn't read it. I can't read things like that because it's just very lengthy, and I don't have the.
Yeah, no, it's hard. It's hard to find chapter and verse. One of our other callers said it's about the length of Moby Dick. I don't know how long Moby Dick is. I read the Cliff Notes, but
honestly,
so it's hard to get chapter and verse. I think some of the reason for that dynamic is he said, well, I'm only going to testify to stuff in the report, so. In order to have him not just say, well, that's beyond the scope of the report, they wanted to cite chapter and verse where it was in the report to justify the question. And I do think that some of the parameters that were put on, and by the way, parameters not only by Robert Mueller, but apparently parameters put on by Attorney General Barr when there was when there were instructions given not to be really circumspect, to be really careful about tiptoeing anywhere beyond the four corners of the report. So I think there were several dynamics going on. And I think when the story is told, some of those parameters end up adding to the story of what might be the most so far successful cover-up in American political history.
Yes, and then it's going to be too late for us when that happens, because this election is coming up, and there's no barriers to cyberspace. There's the country is in jeopardy, and I'm very fatalistic about this because I live next to the state of Pennsylvania, and around this area is very Trumpville. You can't even speak out loud about your ideas about the government. It's just
Well, I hope, Mary, I hope two things. First of all, I appreciate it, but I hope two things. One, I hope you will speak. Because you'd be surprised, and this is a term I learned from Hartmann listeners. I don't know they came up with it. I suspect somebody came up with it. But the blue dots in red seas. There's more of you than we think. And all those places that look like red America, it's purple America. It's 60-40, maybe 65-35. It ain't 80-20. And even if it were 80-20, that means 1 out of 5 people next to you is feeling similar to you. So don't be quiet. Don't fail to speak. And the other is, I empathize with the fatalism. I look at the Electoral College map and how it doesn't map to the population. But we've got to have hope, because hope yields activity. Fear yields inactivity. And activity is what we need. Thanks for the call, and let's all be active. We'll be right back. On the line, we have Tim from Aloha, Oregon. I'm from Oregon, so I don't pronounce it Aloha, Oregon. Tim, how you doing?
It's not Hawaii, so we're okay.
Although we've had a really nice summer. I mean, it's not,
I've been in the same neighborhood for 29 years. I've had this discussion with Tom a number of times. The complacency aspect of what's going on in society is scary. It really is. We've got a lot of people, because I've been in the same neighborhood. I'm the last original owner in this neighborhood for 29 years, and I know everybody. I know what they do for a living. I've watched their kids grow up, and we've got this complacency that's scary. A lot of people are living paycheck to paycheck, and they're concerned with a roof over their head, how to pay a minimum balance on their credit card, and send their kids to school, and they really don't have any. They're scared to talk about politics. What Mueller should have said yesterday, when he should have introduced it by saying we've got a racist, homophobic, misogynistic con man with his finger on the nuclear trigger, and we have to do something about it. That's the only thing that's going to get these people off their seats, to do something. And in addition to that, the really scary part that gave me a twinge in my stomach, I was thinking the Democrats are actually making some progress, but what if they wouldn't have taken over the House? Can you imagine the situation we'd be in right now today with that lunatic in office?
Yeah.
That's scary.
No, like right now, still the apparatus of the executive branch, still the FCC is looking to gut funding for community media organizations,
right?
And any number right now, antitrust enforcement is almost non-existent. I mean, right now the apparatus of the executive branch is being used to the benefit of very few and to the harm of very many. But but imagine if they had not only that, and not only the judicial branch, but double barrels in Congress to enact whatever the heck they wanted. I don't know what would happen to the debt ceiling. I perished the thought. Tim, you had to know, what do you think Mueller, what do you wish Mueller would have done, or what do you think he should have done for his opening statement?
Like I told you, what he should have said is based on what I've done, and he should have emphasized the fact that this guy's been a war hero. He's been involved in making decisions that affect this society for almost 50 years, and it should have been a heartfelt response instead of this technical stuff. Yeah. Because what initially the right wing Trump's base, they don't care what Mueller said. As far as they're concerned, he's been vindicated. And what they're going to do is they're going to watch Fox News. They're not going to watch anything else. Yeah. And then if the people who really understand what Trump has created in this society, many of them are complacent and they won't go out and vote. That's the scary part. If they just get off their rear ends, and how easy it is in Oregon to vote. You know what I mean? Everything comes to you.
And this is, Tim, thank you so much. Thanks for calling, and thanks for being a loyal listener to Tom's show. Two things at least I want to say. One, about fear. What we understand about fear is it makes us freeze. And I'm not equating the two things. I'm being very careful. I'm not equating the two things. I'm not there saying they are the same. But there is still a lesson there. That if you read your Hannah Arendt, if you read your Origins of Totalitarianism, you understand the power of the carrot and stick, the power of fear, the power of keeping people away from the public thing. If you read your Psychology Today, you understand the impact that fear can have, and typically does have, in making people freeze. Fear is not an activity, fear is not an emotion, rather, that helps with proactive action. It shrinks your capillaries. It gets your blood moving away from your extremities. It takes blood flow away from your frontal lobes. It makes you less creative. It makes you less loving. It makes you less able to innovate on behalf of your neighbors. It makes it less likely that you're going to want to help your neighbors. That fear is a strategy, and it's not a strategy new to this president. And the worst tyrants in history have understood this strategy, either explicitly or implicitly. So amen. And second is, therefore, we got to breathe. We got to scan the room. We've got to make sure that we appreciate the beauty, as our previous caller said, of Allegheny Park. We got to make sure that we appreciate the wonderful things that happen in our lives, and then have that fuel us to persist. Not just resist, but to persist, to keep going. And where do we keep going? It ain't all about the presidential election. Now, we are going to cover the Mueller report. We're going to cover the Mueller testimony, committed to doing that. But I'm going to be here for a few more days while Tom is gone. I think I have 6 days as a second out of 6. And we're going to be covering the big stuff that's happening around the country, which I think goes well beyond, and in fact, where people should be spending their time, goes vastly beyond, mostly beyond the presidential race. Each of y'all can have some impact on the presidential race. You can vote. You can get your neighbors to vote. You can participate in the discussion. You can participate in the discussion here. But if you flipped, I think it's 2 seats in the Texas state legislature, you could have an impact on Congress for a decade. And flipping 2 seats in the state legislature is a lot different than trying to flip an entire state in a presidential election, maybe a state you don't live in. Spending an extra few $1,000s in a state Senate race instead of deciding to be a billionaire and running for president. Think about the impact you could have on transforming local elections around the country. If you went out and fought for what you just did, make sure that every blue state that there is was pushing for voter access. If you're in a state like Michigan, which is so gerrymandered that it's locked up, that even though it's a purple state, it's acting like a red state, and you go and you take to the ballot, you go straight to the ballot and make sure that you pass a new system for drawing those districts in a purple state like that that's pretending to be a red state because of falsely drawn districts, you can transform the state of Michigan. There are pro-democracy moves that can happen all over the country. If you live in a city, you can push for that city to enact publicly financed elections to make sure that the big developers, the large corporations don't control politicians at the local level. Why does that matter? Not only so your city is better, not only so that governance in your city resembles democracy, but also because you then start building the kind of leader that is more accountable to human beings than they are to great capital. Making sure we have a new generation of leaders of whatever age that is committed to democracy. And also to make sure that resources are spent not only on, blue on blue fights within urban areas, let public dollars fund that, but make sure that those national fundraising dollars can be focused on things like, say, legislative elections, to make sure that we can transform the map in the country so that it resembles democracy. So we don't have an anti-majoritarian system, we have a pro-majoritarian system. What we've got to do is get away just from fear and towards hope, and translate that hope into action, and action will have impact. Not about the stuff we can't control merely, but also about some of the stuff we can. We're going to be right back. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith, honored to be with you.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. From UN headquarters in New York, I'm Nick Vargas with your...
We say fight back!
Every day here on the Thom Hartmann Program, Louise and I and our team, Sean, Nate, Shira, Dave, Chase, Sue, Nigel, Ron, we all work to put together the very, very best show we possibly can. And there's an enormous amount of work that goes into the show. And one of the things that comes out of that is a lot of content, a lot of specific information that we go through and we dig out and, we want to share with you. And Sue puts that into our newsletter every week. And I think you will, if you don't already receive our newsletter, it comes in email every day, about an hour after we're off the air, or maybe a couple hours after we're off the air. And Sue goes through and pulls literally every link to every story that we talked about and puts it into the newsletter. It's free. We don't sell a list or anything. You complete safety and security. There's no charge. There's no nothing. Just, plug in your email address over at thomhartmann.com and you get signed up for the newsletter. It's all fairly obvious. You'll see it on the website. So check it out, thomhartmann.com. Thank you. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Unequal Protection, How Corporations Became People and How You Can Fight Back by Thom Hartmann. This is from the introduction titled The Battle to Save Democracy. Excuse me. On September 2nd, 2009, the transnational pharmaceutical giant Pfizer pled guilty to multiple criminal felonies. It had been marketing drugs in a way that may well have led to the deaths of people and that definitely led physicians to prescribe and patients to use pharmaceuticals in a way that for which they were not intended. Because Pfizer is a corporation, a legal abstraction, really, it couldn't go to jail like fraudster Bernie Madoff or killer John Dillinger. Instead, it paid a $1.2 billion criminal fine to the U.S. government, the biggest in history, as well as an additional $1 billion in civil penalties. The total settlement was more than $2.3 billion, another record. None of Pfizer's executives, decision makers, stockholders, owners, or employees saw even 5 minutes of the inside of a police station or a jail. Most Americans don't even know about this huge and massive crime, nor do they know that the criminal never spent a day in jail. But they do know that in the autumn of 2004, Martha Stewart was convicted of lying to investigators about her sale of stock in another pharmaceutical company. Her crime cost nobody their life, but she famously was escorted off to a women's prison. Had she been a corporation instead of a human being, odds are there would not have even been an investigation. Yet over the past century, and particularly the past 40 years, corporations have repeatedly asserted that they are, in fact, persons, and therefore eligible for the human rights protections of the Bill of Rights. In 2009, the right-wing advocacy group Citizens United argued before the Supreme Court that they had the First Amendment right to free speech and to influence elections through the production and distribution of a slasher documentary designed to destroy Hillary Clinton's ability to win the Democratic nomination. Some political observers assert that they did this in part because they believed that a black man whose first name sounded like Osama and whose middle name was Hussein could never, ever possibly win against a Republican, no matter how poor a candidate they put up. In that, they were following on a 2003 case before the Supreme Court in which Nike claimed it had the First Amendment right to lie in its corporate marketing, a variation of the First Amendment right of free speech. Corporations haven't limited their grasp to the First Amendment. Pretty much any and virtually every amendment that could be used to further corporate interests has been fair game. As you'll learn in this book, in previous decades, a chemical company took to the Supreme Court a case asserting its Fourth Amendment right to privacy from the EPA, snooping into its illegal chemical discharges. Other corporations have asserted Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination, as well as asserting the 14th Amendment, passed after the Civil War to strip slavery from the Constitution, asserting that it protects their right against discrimination by a local community that doesn't want them building a toxic waste incinerator, commercial hog operations, or superstores. If this trend continues, it's probably just a matter of time before a corporation claims the Second Amendment right to bear arms anywhere, anytime, and your credit card company's bill collector shows up at your home with a sidearm. This legal situation is not only bizarre, but also quite the opposite of the visions for this country held by the founders of the nation and the framers of the Constitution. They were sufficiently worried about corporate power that they didn't even include in the Constitution the word corporation, intending instead that the states should tightly regulate corporate behavior, which the states did quite well until just after the Civil War. The American Revolution, you'll learn in this book, was in fact provoked by the misbehavior of a British corporation. Our nation was founded in an anti-corporate power fury. The most significant and oft-quoted precedent of the turning point of corporate power in America began just after the Civil War. It rested on a constitutional amendment successfully written and passed by a group of radical Republicans after the Civil War. That's what they called themselves, radical Republicans, to take slavery out of the Constitution. Given that today's Republican Party has, largely since the robber baron era of the 1880s, been the party of big business and the very rich, it's a bit difficult for some people to get their minds around the possibility that the Republican Party started out as a reform party, that for nearly 70 years, from before Abraham Lincoln until just after Theodore Roosevelt left the party to start a third party, had a strong progressive wing. But the Republican Party did. Although Lincoln was, by today's standards, a moderate Republican, he was still anti-slavery, pro-middle class, and pro-labor. In fact, he famously said labor is superior to capital because it precedes capital. Nobody has wealth until somebody makes something. And he was the first president both to use the word strike in public and to actually stop police and private armies from killing and beating strikers. And just like in today's mainstream Democratic Party, where there's a progressive minority that always seems to be pushing the edges, in the Republican Party of the 1800s, there was a very, even by today's standards, progressive faction. The radical Republicans were a splinter group that emerged in a big way from the Republican Party at its founding in 1854. And just after the Civil War in 1866, they gained a majority among Republicans in the House of Representatives, where they had a powerful influence until the faction disintegrated in the 1870s during the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. They supported the absolute right of freed slaves to vote and participate in government. It goes on from there. Unequal protection, corporate power. On through this. It's an extraordinary book.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Howdy, everybody. This is the Thom Hartmann Program. And I should say it's Thursday. And something I like to do is Thank You Thursday. I try to think about things that I'm grateful for. What we know about gratitude research, and I know that we're not good enough at it as a nation. What we know from gratitude research is it opens up our brain. It improves our sleep, it improves our health, it improves our relationships, it improves our happiness levels if we can be specific about the things that we're glad are happening in the world. Is there anything out in the world that you're grateful for? Anybody who is doing some public activity that's getting underthanked? Any activist who is working on something or some project that could be a model to other folks? That is always permissible and helpful. And we have to strengthen those muscles a little bit. We have to improve those habits. And the call-in number is 202-808-9925, 202-808-9925. And if you say you got a thank you, if you say you got something for Thank You Thursday, hopefully it'll move you up in the queue. Let's take a call from Rick in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. Rick, you had a question about Trump's tax return, I think.
Yeah, actually, I have two quick points. One thing regarding the Mueller report is, a lot of people don't seem to understand. You only have so much time to answer it. There are details that we are not aware of because we are not in his position. So people need to bear that in mind with some of his answers. I mean, he could probably spend 2 hours in answering some of the questions. That's point A. Point B is, I'm wondering, how come the Democrats are being more aggressive against federal income tax? It just seems like he's hiding something. So why are the Democrats becoming more aggressive in getting his income tax?
Why are they or aren't they?
They are not being very aggressive for getting his federal income
and what
tax.
makes you draw the conclusion they're not being aggressive in getting the tax returns? Right now, Trump has filed 2 lawsuits to block subpoenas, to block requests for his tax returns.
I have never heard anything on the federal level. I've heard the state of New York.
State of New York, right.
I have never heard anything on the federal level, though.
So there is. Thank you very much for the call, and I'll try to answer it, Rick. Appreciate it. There is. Here is one possible rationale, and I will, in preparation for this, I did just a little bit of research, and where I point you, there's a good article on Vox. Can Congress force Trump to hand over his tax returns? I asked 11 legal experts. And the answer quickly, and there's a Sean Illings piece, and the answer is probably, but it's complicated. There are at least two views, all right, but I'm going to use, these are maybe the two paradigmatic views, two example views. One of those views is, well, it's actually, it's a hard question because imagine another scenario. This is from a law professor, University of Iowa. Let's suppose that one of the congressional tax committees is chaired by a racist person. Let's suppose he demands the IRS give him tax returns of various civil rights leaders so he can harass them on account of their race or politics. Under one commonly expressed view, the IRS is helpless here. The statute says the IRS shall furnish tax returns to the committee chair upon request, and that's the end of it. But there's another view. The Constitution applies to Congress. The Supreme Court has repeatedly told us the Constitution permits Congress to perform investigations only when it pursues legitimate legislative purpose. And so there's a question about whether there is a legitimate legislative purpose. Here's the other view. It is offered baldly. It is a view that I think is more accurate. It comes from Daniel Shaviro, from NY, law professor from New York University. Very good law school for what it's worth. This is not an issue on which there is any possibility of reasonable agreement. Any well-informed person who disagrees either that the Ways and Means Committee has an obligation to demand Trump's tax return as part of fulfilling his oversight duties, or that Trump is legally obligated to turn them over, is either a partisan hack or contemptuous of the rule of law. Whether or not we subscribe to his language or his strenuous, how strenuous he holds his view, that is the view that I share. Here's the challenge. It goes back to something Oliver Wendell Holmes said, which is, what a judge will do is all I mean by law. That this question is likely to be answered by the Supreme Court. Who controls the Supreme Court right now? If there's a separation of powers question raised, and that question either gets quickly or slowly to the Supreme Court, how will they rule? And I think some of the concern, there is right now, I think, an internal debate happening. Vice News has another story on this. I'll give you the headline if you want to use Bing. There's other search engines, but Bing is one I'm aware of. Democrats could easily get Trump's tax returns. This is why they won't, by Greg Waters, written just a couple weeks ago, or excuse me, just last month in June. If that's Vice News, Democrats could easily get Trump's tax returns. This is why they won't. And that analysis essentially that they are worried about the conflict between different subpoenas, and getting something getting yes to one might block another. And what that tells me is there is some internal debate about which thing should move first. And I think it's also related to the judicial analysis that if they bring the wrong thing to the wrong court and that court says, no, you can't get any of it, that could foreclose the question. So I think there is some strategic haggling that's happening right now. And again, so I don't think that's merely about aggression. I think it's also about concern about doing it right. That'd be my take. Other people might have different takes. Margie, it might be Margie from Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin. How you doing?
All right. I've got to thank you for Thank You Thursday.
Oh, good.
I would like to thank the electrical workers from 45 municipalities, the phone companies that are showing up to help us after both Friday and Saturday. We received devastating storms that have not been reported at all in the media that took out a large swath of central Wisconsin. We had 90-mile-per-hour straight-line winds. The power companies are doing yeoman's work. I would like to thank all of the people who donated to the Solaris employee who was permanently paralyzed trying to get service back up for telephone.
Over 500,000 people without power, at least for a while, yeah?
Yes, it was. And my hometown of Wisconsin Rapids, which was the town that was hurt the worst, is still without power.
Well, Well, thank you so much for that call, and thank you for saying thank you. The transferring some of our fear and consternation into gratitude is useful. And also, thanks just for letting us know what's going on. 90-mile-an-hour winds in July seems scary.
It's very scary, and it's not. I mean, that's above hurricane force winds, and we don't live near an ocean.
Well, climate change is a hoax. Thank you very much. Is it Margie or Margie?
Margie.
Margie, thank you so much for your call.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Appreciate it. David from St. Paul, we've got just about 30 seconds.
Yeah, hey, thanks for taking my call. Hey, so I just wanted to say that with the Mueller investigation the book is closed on this now, one way or another, I think. And I am going to say that with all the obstruction of justice things that have come out against Trump and his administration, the failure of them to bring witnesses forward, even after being subpoenaed and everything, that the obstruction is going to get more while being less because he has an attorney general that's willing to obstruct for him, so it's going to be less visible to the public and to So I just think there needs to be more focus on this attorney general who's corrupt, more so or just as much as our current illegitimate president. And
Bill Barr, thank you very much, David. Bill Barr getting largely a free pass from the news media, and I will accept from this very specifically Thom Hartmann, who remembered and reminded me of how Bill Barr had been called, was it by William Safire, the cover-up general back in the day. Him getting a free pass, another major mistake of history. We're going to be right back. This is Hartmann Show. I'm Jeff.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program. The number's 202-808-9925. We're going to be back with Common Cause talking about bills to do something about something. Rick from Lexington, Kentucky, you're on the air on Free Speech TV.
Justin, thanks for taking my call. I'm a big fan. I'm a tremendous fan of Mr. Hartmann's, but for you to be a fill-in, you do a tremendous job.
but I'll do. No, I appreciate it. Go ahead.
Okay, I want to label you progressive, American, white male. You okay with that?
Yeah, I want to wait till what you. I mean, I'm not saying I hate white people. But I have my own view. But go ahead. Yeah, I fit within the category, sure.
Okay. All right, Ed. My problem is, and I've talked to Mr. Hartmann about this, that basically I'm okay. Well, not okay, but it's amazing to me the way white people talk to and about white people, especially on cable news. What I mean by that is, I just talked to your telephone person, and basically 10% of black people voted for Trump. 35% of all the others, Latinos, Mexicans, Native Americans, whoever. 60% of white people voted for Trump. Except nobody wants to say white people did that.
Oh, I will.
Republicans, conservatives, evangelicals, blue collars.
No, I'll say it right now. And I'll even go further. I will say that, and I'll add to the biggest terrorist threat in the United States are white people. The biggest risk to liberty and democracy right now is concentrated white supremacy. I got no bones saying that.
Okay, I didn't call you to bash white people.
No, I'm with you though. I'm okay doing that.
But what I did call you to talk about is the truth. I mean, let's start with the truth. We can talk about healthcare or voter suppression or whatever subject you want to talk about. But if we don't start with why do white people support Trump? And basically, if you're going to support Trump, take the label that you are. Because basically, if you support Trump right now, the only reason you can call yourself American is because you were born here. That's all. You have no general philosophies about what it is to be American that you can support Trump. I'm black. Racist, bigot, liar, rapist. Okay, that's enough for me to get out of the line.
Yeah.
Why isn't that enough for white people?
It's a good question. The first thing I'll say is I'm not sure.
I'm sure.
Go ahead.
I'm sure.
All right, you're sure. Well, let me offer my second thought because it might comport with yours, and then it gives you something else to disagree, something to disagree with. My second thought is my hypothesis would be, my understanding, my belief is because it's threatening, it's scary, because nobody wants to think of themselves as the villain in their own story. Because it's uncomfortable to say, it's uncomfortable for the FBI to say that white domestic terrorists are the biggest terrorist threat, because it's hard to put that responsibility. It's easier to put that responsibility on the other. Tim Wise has a really great Twitter thread where he basically says we got to put all the way we beat David Duke in Virginia was by just focusing entirely on we have to be better than this. This can't be who we are as a state. It can't be who we are as a country. They're kicking us off the air. We're going to be back right after this. Thank you so much for your call. I don't see them. Are you asking me to push a button? Welcome back, everybody. I'm Jefferson Smith. This is Thom Hartmann Show. On the air right now, Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan, former speaker. No, Paul Ryan, vice president, policy and litigation with Common Cause. Of the many things that have the risk of being lost by us focusing on the theater of yesterday's hearing, is one piece of that hearing, one piece of that testimony which regarded the attack, the interference on American elections. And it would be really nice if this were not viewed primarily or merely through a lens of political power. It'd be really nice if this weren't seen through a lens of who would benefit and who would lose if, in fact, we protected the sanctity of our elections. There is White House stonewalling. There has been requests for election security bills. To talk about that is with us right now Paul S. Ryan, Vice President at Common Cause. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So what are what were important takeaways? What are things that you think were missed or you want to make sure aren't missed by what much of America watched yesterday?
Well, one of the things that not a single member of the House bothered to ask Special Counsel Mueller yesterday were questions about the legal standard he applied when he was trying to determine whether or not the Trump campaign, Donald Trump himself, illegally coordinated political activity with Russians. Robert Mueller applied the wrong legal standard. He applied a standard that he said that there is no statutory definition of collusion, so he looked to conspiracy law. And then he went on to say that there is no statutory definition of coordination. So he made up a definition of coordination that required an agreement. And that's in direct conflict with longstanding federal campaign finance law. I have no idea why he did that. And I was hoping we'd hear some questions about that yesterday. No one mentioned it. No member of Congress mentioned it.
Do you have speculation? That is such an incredibly important point that I was not dazzled by the legal work by the Mueller report in their desire to actually get at what was going on. If you were going to make a guess as to motive, why do you think was there a particular piece of precedent that would suggest going the route that he went? Why do you think that he applied the standard that he applied?
I really have no hypothesis. I have no good guess. I mean, the way he phrased this section of the report, and this is at the very beginning of volume 1 of his report, the introduction, where he talks about how collusion is not a legal term. So he's looking at conspiracy and coordination. And it is, in fact, true that there is no federal criminal statute. There's no provision in the criminal code that deals with this term coordination or defines it. But again, there is a term in the federal campaign finance law, the Federal Election Campaign Act, which can be enforced with criminal penalties that defines all this. So I have no idea why he limited the scope of his investigation. I mean, and what all this means at the end of the day is if you read through volume 1 of the report, everywhere you see Robert Mueller and his team wrote, we didn't find any evidence or strong evidence of illegal coordination between the Trump team and Russians. What he really meant was we didn't find any strong evidence of an agreement between Donald
So important. What should this standard have been? And I know for folks, this might seem a little weedsy, this might seem a little detailed, but we got some smart listeners. Our folks care about stuff and pay attention, and getting this level of detail, I think, is really important. So what you're saying, the standard to define coordinations, you're allowed to coordinate between foreign governments and domestic campaigns for purposes of winning an election. And you're saying the standard they used was whether or not there was agreement, whether or not Donald Trump sat in a room with Vladimir Putin's buddy and said, hey, I want to help elect you president. And Donald Trump said, yes, I would like you to help me. I'd like you to help me be elected president. And if you do that, I will give you the following things. I'll put those in the Republican Party platform, and they shake on it. And there's a videotape of it, and you show the videotape and said, I gotcha. What should the standard have been?
So there's a couple important building blocks or foundational principles in campaign finance law. Number one is that if someone other than a candidate or a candidate campaign staff makes an expenditure, as that term's defined in federal law, it's defined to mean money spent for the purpose of influencing a federal election. If they make such an expenditure in coordination with a candidate, it's treated as a contribution to the candidate. Foundational principle number two is that foreign nationals are prohibited from making contributions to federal candidates in U.S. elections. And number three, the statute, the Federal Election Campaign Act, defines this term coordination as any expenditure made in cooperation, consultation with, or at the request or suggestion of a candidate. That's number four. There's no mention in the federal coordination statute of an agreement, requirement for agreement.
Say those three words again. Three words. You said cooperation. What were the other? Consultation?
In cooperation, consultation with, or at the request or suggestion of a
candidate. At the request or suggestion of. Okay, go ahead.
And then in 2002, as a provision in the federal McCain-Feingold law, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, Congress included a provision, it's Section 214, ordered the Federal Election Commission to strengthen the FEC's coordination rules and explicitly prohibited the FEC from requiring an agreement as part of the coordination test under the FEC's regulations. So all of this taken together makes it abundantly clear that an agreement is not what Special Counsel Mueller should have been looking for when trying to determine whether or not the Trump team illegally coordinated.
We got about 30 seconds before the break. I don't know if you're able to stick with us past the break. I would love to follow up on this, but let me at least quickly ask this question. If it used a standard, not using the word agreement, but cooperation, consultation, or at the request or suggestion of, what is the evidence you would point to suggest that there would have been, that it would have cleared that standard and justified either an indictment or at least a different recommendation?
At a minimum, the Manafort and Rick Gates provision of internal polling data to Russia.
Yeah. So do you have time to come back after the break?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I'll stick around.
We'll be right back with Paul Ryan from Common Cause. Understanding this, hopefully it adds value to folks. I think it's very interesting, and I know it's really important. We're going to be right back. This is Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith. Thanks for being with us.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
In addition to addressing yesterday's testimony, it's also Thank You Thursday. We got to thank you to the good people in Wisconsin dealing with the power outages. Who do you want to thank?
Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. This is an 1856 first English translation edition of this author. And but you can still get it online. A lot of different booksellers sell it. This is from chapter 11. What sort of despotism democratic nations have to fear? I had remarked during my stay in the United States that a democratic state of society, similar to that of the Americans, might offer singular facilities for the establishment of despotism. And I perceived, upon my return to Europe, how much use had already been made by most of our rulers of the notions, the sentiments, and the wants engendered by this same social condition for the purpose of extending the circle of their power. This led me to think that the nations of Christendom would perhaps eventually undergo some sort of oppression like that which hung over several of the nations of the ancient world. But it would seem that if despotism were to be established among the democratic nations of our days, it might assume a different character, different from the Roman Empire, for example. It might be more extensive and more mild. It would degrade men without tormenting them. I do not question that in an age of instruction and equality like our own, sovereigns might more easily succeed in collecting all political power into their own hands and might interfere more habitually and decidedly within the circle of private interests than any sovereign of antiquity ever could do. But the same principle of equality which facilitates despotism tempers its rigor. When no member of the community has much power or much wealth, tyranny is, as it were, without opportunities or a field of action. As all fortunes are scanty, the passions of men are naturally circumscribed, their imagination limited, their pleasures simple. This universal moderation moderates the sovereign himself and checks within certain limits the inordinate stretch of his own desires. Independently of these reasons, drawn from the nature of the state of society itself, I might add many others arising from causes beyond my subject, but I shall keep within the limits I have laid down to myself. Democratic governments may become violent and even cruel at certain periods of extreme effervescence or of great danger. Excuse me, think of George Bush and 9/11. But these crises will be rare and brief. When I consider the petty passions of our contemporaries, the mildness of their manners, the extent of their education, the purity of their religion, the gentleness of their morality, their regular and industrious habits, and the restraint with which they almost all observe in their vices, no less than in their virtues, I have no fear that they will meet with tyrants in their rulers, but rather guardians. I think then that the species of oppression by which democratic nations are menaced is unlike anything that ever existed before in our world. Our contemporaries will find no prototype of it in their memories. I am trying myself to choose an expression which will accurately convey the whole of the idea I have formed of it, but in vain. The old words, despotism and tyranny, are inappropriate. The thing itself is new, and since I cannot name it, I must attempt to define it. I seek to trace the novel features under which despotism may appear in the world. The first thing that strikes the observation is an immutable multitude of men, all equal and alike, incessantly endeavoring to procure the petty and paltry pleasures with which they glut their lives. Think now of a television society. Each of them, living apart, is as a stranger to the fate of all the rest. His children and his private friends constitute to him the whole of mankind. As for the rest of his fellow citizens, he is close to them, but he sees them not. He touches them, but he feels them not. He exists, but in himself and for himself alone. And if his kindred still remain to him, he may be said at any rate to have lost his country. Above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power, which takes upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate. Facebook? That power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood, but it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. It is well content that people should rejoice, providing that they think of nothing but rejoicing. For their happiness, such a government willingly labors, but it chooses to be the sole agent and only arbiter of that happiness. It provides for their security, foresees and supplies their necessities, facilitates their pleasures, manages their principal concerns, directs their industry, regulates the descent of property, and subdivides their inheritances. What remains but to spare them all the care of thinking and all the trouble of living? Thus, it every day renders the exercise of the free agency of man less useful and less frequent. It circumscribes the will within a narrower range and gradually robs a man of all the uses of himself. The principle of equality has prepared men for these things. It has predisposed men to endure them and oftentimes to look on them as benefits. I have always thought that the servitude of the regular, quiet, and gentle kind, which I have just described, might be combined more easily than is commonly believed with some of the outward forms of freedom, and that it might even establish itself under the wing of the sovereign of the people. Our contemporaries are constantly excited by two conflicting passions, They want to be led, and they wish to remain free. As they cannot destroy either one or the other of these contrary propensities, they strive to satisfy them both at once. They devise a sole, tutelary, and all-powerful form of government, but elected by the people. They combine the principle of centralization and that of popular sovereignty. This gives them a respite. They console themselves for being in tutelage by the reflection that they have chosen their own guardians. And it continues. It's a brilliant book. A Democracy in America by de Tocqueville.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
I'm Jefferson Smith. Hope we're having a good, thankful Thursday. And as part of that, thank you to Patricia. On this note, I volunteer in local schools and at local hospice. I am particularly grateful for the children and the visionaries who conceived of and financed the hospice. Amen. We lost our mom late last year. We're still dealing with it. And my stepmom, actually, my mom died when I was in high school, but my birth mom. But the hospice workers for dealing with both of those were saints, were such a gift to our family, and I know a gift to so many other families. Also, we got a call in. Yes, we're aware that Donald Trump did a speech in front of a Russian eagle, a two-headed seal rather than the United States eagle, and instead of just holding arrows, was holding golf clubs. We're aware of that. And also to folks, here is a quick note about Puerto Rico. So should we be covering Puerto Rico? Yes. Why does it matter now? Well, for one thing, we should care about these human beings. We should care about democracy in general. We should also care about our interaction with elements of our country, including those who have not been granted or not asked for statehood status. But also this, for another caller and who made the comment, and a frequent comment we get, what if Donald Trump loses the election but doesn't stand down? What we just saw in Puerto Rico is probably what has to be done. That if there is a refusal by this president to abide by a lawful election, that we'll need more than Ricky Martin waving a flag. We will need millions of people in streets around the country, and more than the Proud Boys can try to scare away. I want to go right back to our guest who's been waiting patiently, Paul Ryan from Common Cause. Paul Ryan was offering before the break that Mueller used what he would argue is the wrong, and I would agree is the wrong, legal standard for coordination, illegal coordination of campaign finance activities. He used the standard of agreement when in fact what the statute calls for is cooperation, consultation, or at the request or suggestion of. Then I asked the question, well, what turns on that? Why does it matter if you use the standard of agreement versus either cooperation, consultation, or at the request or suggestion of it? He said, well, at the very least, the providing to Russian actors the voter information to be used to impact the elections. Feel free to continue that point, Paul. Thank you so much for waiting so patiently.
I'm happy to have waited. The one other thing I want to mention is that when the Federal Election Commission did strengthen its coordination rules in response to Congress saying, hey, FEC, you got to strengthen your rules, do not require an agreement, a couple of the criteria that the FEC put into the rules that would determine or establish when coordination existed was that if the campaign itself had any material involvement in the spenders, in this case Russia's, decisions about the intended audience for the communication or the timing of the communication. So at a minimum, we know that Paul Manafort, as well as Rick Gates, at the direction of Paul Manafort, provided a bunch of internal Trump campaign polling data to some intermediaries, Ukrainian, Russian, that eventually, we presume, made its way to the Russians themselves who are responsible for this interference, election interference. If the Russians relied on that information, figure out who they were going to target, what states they were going to run their social media campaigns in, what segments of the populations or social media users, Facebook users, for example, should be seeing those ads, then it's quite possible there was illegal coordination. But we don't know because Robert Mueller didn't look for that type of evidence. Once he concluded, presumably, that there was no agreement, that Paul Manafort did not agree to anything by the Russian or with the Russians on behalf of the Trump campaign, he seemingly stopped looking.
So I want to use an analogy that may or may not be apt, but I think about like antitrust law. I think about like price fixing. Okay, so if I'm Delta Airlines and I call up the head of American Airlines and I say, okay, if you set your if you raise the price of your ticket to $1,200, we will also raise the price of our ticket to $1,200, and we won't try to undercut you by charging $1,100. That we know that's a violation for price fixing. What if I'm the head of Delta Airlines and I just send over to American Airlines the prices that I am going to set, and I do that in advance of setting them, all right, and then I watch to see what they do back? Is that unlawful coordination? I know that the antitrust law and price fixing is different, but I want to look at other contexts in addition to election context.
I think your analogy is a good one. I'm an expert on election law. I've been doing election law for 20 years. I'm not an expert on airlines price fixing antitrust law, but it sounds like a reasonable analogy to me. So what you're saying is there didn't need to be the return response. Say, oh, hey, thanks for this. There didn't have to first be a request necessarily. Hey, would you please provide to us that election information? But that kind of request, had it happened, or more importantly, for your point, had Mueller investigated to see if it had happened, that even if they hadn't added, hey, please give us this information. If you do, we will help you win the election. And if you do, and we help you win the election, we will get some consideration for that, some payback for that. That even if there was just the request or just that information and they used it, that could have been enough to show a violation of campaign finance law. I think your point is extraordinarily important. Is that matter now foreclosed because Mueller's testimony is done? Is there any, and of course, Attorney General Barr doesn't want to take down this president. He is there to serve as a blocker for him. Is there anything that can be done with respect to that coordination, that unlawful, your argument of that unlawful coordination? There's two avenues forward for holding this president accountable for illegal activity in 2016, as well as other illegal activities. And one is an impeachment investigation, perhaps concluding in articles of impeachment. And Common Cause just last night announced that we are calling on Congress to open a formal impeachment investigation into Donald Trump, an inquiry of impeachment. And Congress could do something about this. If Congress looks at this law, concludes that Robert Mueller applied the wrong legal standard, and through its own investigation determines that the Trump campaign violated these campaign finance laws, that would presumably be an impeachable offense. There's a bunch of other grounds for impeachment, or at least an impeachment investigation that we put forth in a report that we published last night that's available on our website at www.commoncause.org. But the other avenue, in addition to a congressional impeachment inquiry, is the Federal Election Commission. The Federal Election Commission has enforcement authority here. I have filed complaints with the FEC on a number of these matters over the past year and a half to 2 years, and the FEC has a job now to take up its civil enforcement investigations and punishing these wrongdoing now that the Department of Justice has seemingly concluded its investigation.
One other thing I want to, and so I heard you, so Congress could do something and impeachment proceedings could do something. One other quick matter before we have to move on, and thank you so much for spending time with us, Paul Ryan again from Common Cause. And this is the matter of the election security bills. That's something that isn't just about Trump, but that is about the sanctity of our elections and the interference in those elections, and that in fact there were bills to address that. And what's happened to those bills? What, McConnell's blocking them?
McConnell's blocking them. He's getting some other senators to block them, other Republican senators. Some of this legislation is even bipartisan. There was a bill blocked yesterday that was introduced by Democrat Senator Wyden of Oregon, as well as Senator Cotton, a Republican from Arkansas. And that was blocked by McConnell. There were a couple other bills that would have required mandatory reporting if a U.S. campaign got contacted by a foreign national who wanted to help that campaign. Under these two other bills that were blocked yesterday, would have required that campaign to tell the Federal Election Commission and the FBI that a foreign national or a foreign country was trying to interfere in our elections. All being blocked by McConnell. It's outrageous, to put it bluntly. I mean, Special Counsel Mueller made clear yesterday, not only did Russian interference happen in 2016, but foreign interference campaigns are underway now to influence and hijack our 2020 election. This is a problem all Americans, regardless of party, should care about, and Congress has to act.
What's the argument? Now, I understand the motive, all right, or at least I can understand at least one or two motives. The most conspiratorial of those could be, well, they're sort of in on the fix. The other could just be, well, they're blocking it because they see that, pro-Trump interference in the election helps Republicans, and so why would Republicans stop that? But they're probably not going to say that as their argument. If they, for instance, an analogy I'll use is various voter suppression stuff. They don't come out and say, well, the reason we want to block voter suppression is because we think that young people of color and renters aren't going to support oligarchs and Republicans. What they say is, I don't know, they have a different argument about why it's important, because there's voter fraud or some other thing. What's the argument for not passing, for not even allowing a vote on election protection, on election sanctity legislation?
Well, you might have, perhaps it was inadvertent, but you just hit the nail on the head. The argument that they are making now for blocking these election security measures is that these bills are targeting foreign election interference, and they don't have the voter suppression provisions that Republicans want to pass. So these voter suppression bills, the voter ID and other voter suppression tactics, they get dressed up by Republicans as election security tactics. They are solutions to problems that don't exist. Voter ID, for example, it's a policy that makes it harder to vote and doesn't solve any actual existent fraud problem. Their arguments this week, Senator McConnell's argument is, hey, these bills are partisan because they don't include the so-called election security provisions we Republicans want, even though those so-called election security provisions are really voter suppression tactics.
Well, Paul Ryan, would love to talk to you again. Really appreciate your time. Where can people find out more? Probably at commoncause.org. You
got it. Thank you so much for having me on the program.
Appreciate your work. You're priceless.
Thank you.
For folks who nerd out on this stuff, and I have said before and I will say again, to me the fight here is democracy. That is what is at stake. I say that not to be an alarmist. I say that as a strategist. I say that as an armchair moral philosopher. That is the first principle, the raison d'etre. That is the thing that I hope will bind us, motivate us, and push us forward. I'll give one little plug for people who care about that new podcast, Democracy Nerd. You can get it at xraypod.com. Just has a couple episodes just starting out, but that's xraypod.com. Thank you for being Democracy Nerds. We're going to be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Y'all are priceless. We'll be back with your calls, 202-808-9925. I'm Jeff. Gretchen, we're going to do a speed round on Free Speech TV. You're on the air, on the TV.
Hey, Jeff, nice to hear you. Listen, I'm glad you were talking about the security of elections, because I think Pelosi needs to get all the representatives that are on board with impeachment and get out on the front steps of the House and get in front of the media and let them know just how many bills they have passed to secure our elections and to make life easier for people, because nobody knows.
HR 1, amen, Gretchen. HR 1, the first thing they did upon winning election was about election security, was about election protection, was about the sanctity of democracy. And in fact, on the thing I was just plugging on, Democracy Nerd just did, we only use clips of it for the podcast, but I talked for about an hour with Representative Sarbanes, so I'll put that together. I think we've all got to be talking about it more. I sometimes forget. I'll try not to.
Okay, because people got to know that the House isn't just sitting on their duffs, not doing anything.
Yep.
It's McConnell that is not bringing these things to the Senate.
Yeah.
He's the one. He's the Grim Reaper.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Gretchen. And I'll say something else. We had a caller earlier from Free Speech TV that was saying, asking about why won't white voters, why won't white members of Congress talk about white people and the role that they're playing in democracy and their role in electing Donald Trump. And I offered my view that I think so much of it is because of the discomfort of the topic of white supremacy. It's hard for white people to acknowledge their own privilege and acknowledge their own role in oppression. There is also a tactical challenge. The New York Times has been talking about it just recently, which is that right now the Electoral College map is benefiting, is prioritizing, is necessitating, or at least indicating the possibility of the need to prioritize states that have smaller black populations. Rust Belt states more than Sun Belt states. There are those who say you can win with a different map. If you change some states in the South, if you win Texas, you can win with a different map. But there's also a risk that you get pretty close in Texas, like Beto O'Rourke did, but you don't quite win. You don't get any electoral college votes, even though you run up the score on your popular vote math. So there is this fixation. Some would say it's an undue or overwhelming fixation on those Midwestern states. But let me tell you something that brings us all together, or that at least brings the supermajority of the country together, and that is democracy. In Wisconsin and in Florida and in Texas and in South Carolina and in Arizona and in Michigan and in California and in New York and in North Carolina and in Alabama and in Washington State, and you continue to go down the line, and you will find a supermajority of people who care about democracy, who want to fight corruption, who want us to be stronger together than we are apart. And that's something that should be at the top of all of our mouths, the top of all of our tongues, the top of all of our lists. Thank you, Gretchen, for reminding me. James, we got probably about a minute. Go ahead from Spokane.
Hey, good morning.
Oh, I got 10 seconds. Go ahead. Very quick point.
Oh, geez. Just wanted to let the people know that what they're doing to the Trump fans, I call them foxholes for obvious reasons. What they're doing at the border to those refugees, they will do to any of their supporters or their children as soon as the time arrives.
First, they came for the children of immigrants. Who do they come from next? James, you made a critically important point in not very many seconds. We appreciate it. We're going to be right back. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Jefferson Smith. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. We're talking about democracy, and we're talking about what's happening now. It's also Thank You Thursday. If you want to call in with your gratitude, you can also tweet at me at Jefferson D. Smith, or you can tweet at Thom Hartmann. Right now on the line, we've got Bob Ney, Talk Media News, talkmedianews.com, friend of the show. Bob Ney, thank you so much for joining us. Bob is there. Go ahead, Bob.
Yes, I'm grateful to be on the show. Thank you.
What's going on in the world that we're missing?
Well, let me start with the Department of Justice, which has just announced, by the way, this was record speed, that it won't prosecute the Attorney General or Barr or the Commerce Secretary, Ross, will not prosecute him after the House voted earlier this month to hold them in criminal contempt. And this was announced by the Deputy Attorney General, Jeffrey Rosen. And he wrote a letter to the Speaker and described the department's, quote, longstanding position to not prosecute an official for contempt of Congress for declining to provide information subject to a presidential assertion of executive privilege, which the president can basically do for almost anybody. And the reason I also wanted to mention this story, because something I haven't really found in some additional stories, is the fact that the Senate itself operates under a different rule, by the way, when it comes to the contempt. Obviously, Jefferson, as you know, if they're not going to enforce contempt of Congress, the Justice Department, and they've already very swiftly declined this because the Holder case under Obama and Harriet Meyer's case under George Bush took 6 years to decide the contempt issue. 6 years. So this was what? This has been a month or two. Now, the Senate has a rule, and the Senate can, no matter what the Justice Department does, the Senate and its committees, by an internal rule, are authorized to bring a lawsuit under a federal statute. That lawsuit would be in the federal district court in Washington, D.C. Now, the House doesn't have a rule like that, but the federal district court in Washington has decided if the House wants to, they can nevertheless authorize its committees to bring a civil lawsuit that's similar for enforcement of a subpoena. And the reason I raise this, obviously, this administration is going to deny, squash and quash and everything else under the sun, every single contempt motion that's brought. So the House may, at some point in time, I would assume, want to also go through and authorize itself. It can change its rules in a heartbeat and authorize itself to be able to go after the people that won't come in to talk to the Congress. Obviously, Don McGahn would be, I assume, on everybody's counsel to the president on everybody's list to get there.
So let's back up just a second. It's so important. And it also gets back to something we were talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. We had at least 2 callers who called in with questions synonymous to, why won't the Democrats be more aggressive with blank? And one of the challenges is what you just offered, that one way they can be aggressive is by requiring testimony. And if somebody doesn't testify, they can issue a subpoena, and they can be under contempt of Congress for not doing it. But it is up to the executive branch, apparently, to enforce the law. And if the executive branch decides not to enforce the law, what do we do? And you're saying that the alternative is to go to a different court to get some other constable to enforce a civil requirement. Run through that again very quickly.
Yes. And again, the Senate has had this rule for quite a while. So just for clarification, the Senate and its committees today can say, you instead of going in contempt of Congress and going through the Attorney General, the Senate and its committees are authorized. They can bring a lawsuit under a federal statute, a civil lawsuit, under a federal statute in the district court in Washington, D.C., District of Columbia. They can bring it. So they will enter into the suit. It's just another means to bypass, obviously if you have a hostile Attorney General, then this would be a means to do it. The House does not have such a rule. But the court has already made a statement that nevertheless, if the House were to authorize something like this, they could go through the same process as the Senate. Now, you're not going to see the Senate doing this because it's controlled by Mitch McConnell.
Right.
So the House
that's very helpful.
This is sort of sitting there, Jefferson. I'm not sure why the House had, or if they thought this through or not, but this is another tactic to come at another way at this administration, which is obviously in record time killing these motions to have some people come testify before the House.
That's very helpful. Anything else? You want to make sure we want to cover that more? Or you want to make sure we cover something else?
No, I just wanted to, make sure I threw that out there because I'm just wondering, and I'm not recalling when I was there that we ever had a situation like that, but I was surfing the rules, and if the Senate can do it, the House can do it, and the House is obviously the Democratic-controlled portion, because the Senate's not going to do any of that.
Because it's not a statute that need to be passed, it's a rule. So that means the majority, that they could just pass it as a rule. It would apply only to, the ambit of passing that rule will be fully within the House. That's helpful. Anything else you want to make sure we cover?
Well, just the fact that the Senate Republicans have blocked 2 election security bills.
Yeah,
they did it based on federalizing elections, which is absolutely not true. It would not federalize anything at all.
Well, Bob Ney, we appreciate you calling as always.
Thank
you be well. You're listening to Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith. Let's take very quickly. Got about 1 minute. Tamara's call from Carl Junction, Missouri.
Well, I have a thank you Thursday, and it's to the person or persons who changed that presidential seal at Trump's rally last night. Because after he gave that speech on the White House lawn after the hearing, he deserved it. That 2-headed eagle is a Russian eagle. And the eagle holding the golf club, it gave me hope that maybe Colt 45 is beginning to crack.
So Colt 45, I think I just heard. Other people may have heard that before. I hadn't. Colt 45, is that what I heard you say?
Yes, Colt 45. That's what we call the people that follow Trump with no question.
All right, appreciate it.
And it gave me hope because they screen who works his rallies.
Yeah. No, I have. I have heard the Colt. What I usually use the red wall. But very much appreciate the call and the gratitude, Tamara. We're going to be right back. You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. I'm Jefferson Smith. Here are you.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
You know, every day here on the Thom Hartmann Program, Louise and I and our team, Sean, Nate, Shira, Dave, Chase, Sue, Nigel, Ron, we all work to put together the very, very best show we possibly can. And there's an enormous amount of work that goes into the show. And one of the things that comes out of that is a lot of content, a lot of specific information that we go through and we dig out and, we want to share with you. And Sue puts that into our newsletter every week. And I think you will, if you don't already receive our newsletter, it comes in email every day, about an hour after we're off the air, or maybe a couple hours after we're off the air. And Sue goes through and pulls literally every link to every story that we talked about and puts it into the newsletter. It's free. We don't sell the list or anything. You complete safety and security. There's no charge. There's no nothing. Just, plug in your email address over at thomhartmann.com and you get signed up for the newsletter. It's all fairly obvious. You'll see it on the website. So check it out, thomhartmann.com. Thank you. Created a website to honor workers who died on the job. Quote, more than 4,500 workers, lose their lives on the job every year. Below are the names of just a few who have died in recent months. OSHA's mission is to prevent workplace injuries, illnesses, and death, end quote. That Occupational Safety and Health Administration webpage was intended to highlight and humanize workplace deaths, to ensure awareness of tragedies, especially those that could have been avoided, according to Jordan Barab, an Assistant Secretary of Labor during the Obama administration. Barab explained, without information like this, fatality statistics are just raw, sterile numbers. The purpose of adding names and circumstances was to impress people with the tragedy that workers and their families face day after day. In August 2017, Trump's Labor Department quietly removed the preamble and the names when it killed the web page. It also took down, without public announcement, the fatality inspection data for all years prior to 2017. Those were just two of many other Trump administration actions inimical to worker safety. Others included no longer posting press releases about deaths resulting from unsafe working conditions, delaying rules to reduce sickness and death from inhaling silica and beryllium at work, delaying rules to lower the risk of railroad engineers and truck drivers falling asleep at the switch or wheel because of untreated sleep apnea, and the appointment to the Supreme Court of a judge who held that a company had the right to fire a worker who chose not to freeze to death on the job. A reasonable person listening to Donald Trump's inaugural address would never have expected these and other actions, assuming he believed what Trump said. Trump declared, "The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no more. You came by the tens of millions to become part of a historic movement, the likes of which the world has never seen before. At the center of this movement is a crucial conviction that a nation exists to serve its citizens," end quote. Those men and women were forgotten again the following week. And it's not just workers whose interests were forgotten, not to mention who were put in danger. By deciding not to implement a rule to reduce the chances of truck drivers and train operators falling asleep at the wheel, Trump put at risk the lives of families driving along the highway, people riding on passenger trains, and many others. The White House called it President Trump's war on regulation. In his weekly radio address in early May, he declared that we've removed one job-killing regulation after another, and they're not pretty, and they're going. And believe me, we're just getting started on regulations. They're gone. Removal of data on workplace deaths, which averaged 13 per day, infuriated Jordan Barab, who was Obama's number 2 at OSHA. As a private citizen, Barab created a webpage to keep track of the names of the dead and the reasons they were killed on the job. He called it, "OSHA won't tell you who died in the workplace, we will." After the election, Barab's concerns that the Trump administration would be bad for workers increased when he asked where the Trump beachhead team was and learned that none was coming. Each incoming administrator sends people to scope out federal agencies, learn who does what, and get a feel for the place in advance. Then the incoming administration sends its landing team, the people who will initially implement its policies for each agenda or at each agency. When no beachhead team came up, Barab figured it meant worker safety simply was not a priority for Trump. He hoped that was the worst of it, nothing more than apathy about worker safety. But when the landing team arrived, Barab realized trouble was coming for American workers, and it was not official apathy, but the start of assaults on workers' rights and safety. Rob said most of them had no idea they were going to labor and no interest in workers' issues either. What they did have was a mandate to delay, repeal, or weaken regulations that protected workers as part of Trump's plan to eliminate, quote, any regulation that is outdated, unnecessary, bad for workers, or contrary to the national interest, end quote. The first sign came when Trump nominated Judge Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. Gorsuch was an acolyte of Antonin Scalia, whose seat he would be taking. Like Scalia, he said statutes should be literally read, and if that made no sense, well, that was a problem for Congress. Also like Scalia, he had a habit of consulting dictionaries, often following Scalia's practice of relying on the third, fourth, or even lesser definition of a word when it supported his jurisprudence. Trump's nomination alarmed unions. Jody Calamine, a communications worker of America lawyer, told Gorsuch's Senate confirmation hearing that Gorsuch, quote, is a threat to working people's health and safety, end quote. Calamine cited Gorsuch's dissent in the 2016 case to make his point. That dissent, he said, reveals an anti-worker bias and features the judicial activism that will ultimately put workers' lives at risk, end quote. Those are unusually strong words about a Supreme Court nominee, but a review of the case shows Gorsuch has little regard for human life, at least when it comes to employers' power over their workers. He considers a rigid interpretation of the law more important. The case was about a law Congress passed giving workers the right to refuse dangerous tasks. Gorsuch said, no, you may not refuse. It's even worse than you think, by David K. Johnston.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Jefferson Smith. On the line, we've got William Hartung. He's the director of Arms and Security Project, the Center for International Policy. He's the author of Profits for War, Lockheed Martin, and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex. And while we're focused a bunch on the Mueller testimony, I also want to make sure we're continuing to cover critical issues of substance that should be being discussed by presidential candidates. One of those is, how should we structure national defense? How do we structure national defense for national security, and also for morality, and also for international security, and also for sensible use of finances? To offer some of those thoughts is William Hartung. William, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thanks for having me.
All right. In 30 seconds or less, how should we structure the entirety of the American national defense system?
Well, I think for starters, we have to stop preparing for the kind of disastrous wars we've had in Iraq and Afghanistan, which would allow us to reduce forces. We have to stop the nuclear weapons buildup, which is supposed to cost $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years. We have to look at Russia and China in a more realistic light. Neither of them is a direct military threat to the United States, and we need to look for areas of cooperation as well as competition, which would also put some limits on the budget. And then there's all kinds of waste at the Pentagon. Excess contractors, overpaying for spare parts, cost overruns on weapons. We need to get tough with those corporations that are basically bilking the taxpayer. And we have a task force called the Sustainable Defense Task Force that said doing all of that would save a minimum of $1.2 trillion over the next 10 years, probably considerably more.
In the debate, I mean, really, it's post World War II, Cold War era debate about the national defense budget, about the military budget. the contours have seemed somewhat predictable, right? The contours are, well, there's a lot of overspending at the Pentagon. It's getting us, we build this stuff and then we use it. And even in times we don't need to use it, we have built, what Eisenhower warned us of, this military-industrial complex, which will push a tendency to wage conflict, even when not only is it not necessary, but it can be counterproductive. Talk about the Sustainable Defense Project, or talk about an alternative view. One concern at least is, you're so worried about hurting other people, or so worried about overspending here. You're not that worried about overspending on welfare, you leftist. That it's really all just about being a bleeding heart liberal. If you were speaking to a security concern, if you were speaking about how we make sure that America's kept safe, how do you make that case?
Well, I think there's a couple things. First of all, people have to realize that we're spending immense amounts, one of the highest levels since World War II, higher than Vietnam, higher than Korea, higher than the Reagan buildup, almost twice the Cold War average, at a time when there's really no existential threat to the United States, if there ever was one. So there's a notion that somehow the Pentagon's been hobbled, the forces aren't ready because there's not enough money. That's nonsense. So I think that's the first point. And to spend at those levels puts pressure on the budget in many ways. It increases interest on the debt, makes it harder to invest in other national needs. It completely ignores some of the biggest threats we face, like climate change, epidemics of disease, which threaten far more people than things like terrorism, which is primarily, at this point, a domestic concern, not a global concern. So I think if you are concerned about sort of what are your priorities for protecting the country, fighting Iraq-style wars should not be a priority. In fact, it's a negative if we were to continue to do that kind of thing. Russia and China, we don't want an arms race with two nuclear armed powers. We don't want to be planning scenarios for how to go to war with them. We want to be figuring out areas of cooperation, be it arms control with Russia, be it working with China to deal with climate change, be it coming to some understanding of China's regional role and not assuming the United States can dominate Asia in the way it has, during the past. So, I think it really comes down to what's actually needed to defend the United States versus what is military overreach that's going to cause more damage than it could possibly prevent.
Let me ask about this through a political lens, maybe a democracy lens, but at least a political lens. I remember a piece of mail that I got. Exactly why they sent it to me, I'm not sure. It was from John McCain. And it was brilliantly done, because I had for a long time, like many of us, remarked at what felt like a inconsistency, shall we say, a mean way of calling it would be hypocrisy, pushing for ratcheting down federal spending, of decrying involvement of the government, in decrying taxation generally, decrying the building of the national debt, except when one remembers that since 1981, every Democratic president has reduced the national debt and every Republican president has increased it. But and I'd remarked and noticed, and that inconsistency, maybe that hypocrisy. And I got this letter from John McCain, and it was a whole packet of materials, and it said the liberals in Washington are spending so much money that it's taking it away from your defense and making you less safe. I was like, oh yeah, that's the turn of argument. That's the way it makes sense. And this has been, really the Reagan era Republican argument has been strong spending, big spending, large spending, maybe overspending on defense, and cut spending for everything, just about everything else. I now think about more contemporaneously, more modernly, look at what's happening with criminal defense, with criminal justice, and that there are starting to be bipartisan coalitions who are getting together. Heck, Koch brothers have participated in some of it, in reducing spending on prisons, where you get the folks on the right-hand side of the aisle who say, yeah, we want to save some state and national money on prisons, and you have folks on the left-hand side of the aisles, yeah, we want to have our criminal justice system be a little less racist and a little less oppressive and abusive. What is the political path towards the kind of bipartisan thing, or maybe it's another pathway than that, but the kind of bipartisan thing that we're starting to see on criminal justice that so far we haven't seen, because instead of what we've seen is that John McCain letter?
Well, there is a minority within the Republican and conservative camp that says we're spending too much on the Pentagon. Groups like National Taxpayers Union, groups like Committee to Reduce Spending, even Grover Norquist's folks have said at a certain point, we can't even audit the Pentagon. Why are we giving it endless amounts of money? So there is a coalition called the Pentagon Budget Campaign, left, right, and center, that's been trying to push that argument. I think it's been weakened by the fact that Trump threw this big tax cut at the right. And I think some of the groups on the right that had been critical have been more muted because of that. But there are still sort of budget hawks who are willing to work with progressives to try to, put some sort of limits on the Pentagon budget. But things have been moving in the opposite direction the last 2 or 3 years. Huge increases, ways to evade the Budget Control Act, which was supposed to cap the Pentagon budget. So we're really reaching, historic levels of spending. We're going to have to roll it back. And I think, there's a lot of tension on the progressive side because progressive candidates, for example, are saying, let's have Medicare for all, let's have a Green New Deal, things that involve domestic investment. You can't do that and also steeply cut taxes and give the Pentagon everything it wants and more. So
no, some of the money is in the banana stand. Some of the money is in the Pentagon. Let me ask this. We got about 20 seconds. Say just a little bit about the political power that props up the Pentagon budget. Well,
a lot of it is Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, spending millions on campaign contributions, hundreds of millions on lobbyists. You've got a head of former Raytheon lobbyist running the Pentagon. Under Trump, it's the military-industrial complex on steroids.
Thank you so much for taking the time. William Hartung, you can find him as the Director of Armed Security Projects, Center for International Policy. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be right back. Caller's been waiting patiently, 202-808-9925. I'm Jeff. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. Kurt from Spokane, Free Speech TV, you are on.
Yeah, thanks for taking my call, Jeff. I was wondering, I watched the Mueller report, not the whole thing, but part of it, and it seems to me, and my question is there enough evidence, and if Mueller is a credible witness, which I think he is, to indict the president on obstruction of justice charges and the impeachment hearings that have taken place?
I think yes. In fact, I'm going to try to find the person who I thought said it best. Let me first say, I can guess your own view, but what's your view?
Oh, I think that it's clear, starting going all the way back to the firing of Comey, and it just seems that he has not, his administration has not cooperated. In fact, they've actually sabotaged any legitimate inquiry. So that's just kind of how I see it.
No, I appreciate it, Kurt, and I'll offer you my view. If I were writing this report, or if I had had a chance to receive the report I would have liked, using the same facts, it would have first flipped it. It would have started, it would have really emphasized what had happened with Russian elections, and then it would have started with obstruction. And it would have laid out the case for obstruction. And then it would have gone to the underlying predicates, the underlying crime. And there's a reason for that order. And I would have adopted the common cause understanding that illegal campaign finance coordination does not require agreement, that's not in the statute, cooperation, consultation, or at the request or the suggestion of. And I would have indicated those things. But then in the obstruction portion of the memo, I would have said, by the way, let's be really, and this is the reason I wish that Bob Mueller was a was in tune with this moment in history a little bit better than I think he is, then I wish he would have been willing to wave his arms a little bit and say, hey, folks, the reason why it was hard to find evidence to demonstrate that coordination, to demonstrate that conspiracy, is because justice was obstructed. Is because witnesses died, because some stayed in Russia, because witnesses lied, and we had to convict them and did convict them for lying, because the number one witness, because individual number one wouldn't testify, despite repeated requests and the obvious necessity of his testimony. Because justice was in fact blockaded, justice on this particular issue is harder. That's why, by the way, obstruction of justice exists as a crime. Because sometimes you can only get that. One of the stupidest arguments, I said that a little loud, but one of the stupidest arguments, well, how can you have obstruction if you don't have an underlying crime? This is, to some degree, Bill Barr's view. The reason that is so stupid is the reason you have obstruction of justice as a crime is because the very act of obstructing the justice can make it hard to get to the underlying justice. And then you get to obstruction of justice and you lay out the litany of facts. And I will quote Glenn Kirshner. And he used a website called twitter.com, stating the obvious. Mueller laid out the evidence that satisfied, fulfilled every element of the offense of obstruction, but just did not state Trump committed the crime of obstruction of justice. It's exactly like saying Trump walked into a bank, pulled a gun, demanded the money, was given the money by the teller, fled the bank. It did not belong to him. But I'm not saying Trump committed the crime of bank robbery. Yes, there is enough evidence to indict on obstruction of justice. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Jefferson Smith. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. To you in Chicago, Hector, watching us on YouTube, thank you so much for doing it, and thanks for calling.
It's so weird. His name is Mueller, and he said clearly that Trump was guilty, and he couldn't press charges because of the law and how Congress has to do their job and do it. And they need to hear him, ask him questions about what's in his report. The whole thing is because I talked to Chuy Garcia, and he said the members of Congress are slow. Now, I know what slow means. It means paid off. And, of course, we're in a mob state. It comes down to you and your desires of either having no democracy and being a third-class citizen if you're of color. And sure, we have friends. I don't know what it means. I don't know what a Great Depression means. Well, something about empty shelves and America going bankrupt, of course, and forgotten by the rest of the world. Especially we have no ambassadors, or however few or how many, but many not negative or whatever.
Hector, I want to make sure I have a chance to respond or at least hear your most important point or a question you want to ask.
It's just the extreme frustration you must have to actually be a sane American.
I hear you. Yeah, it can be challenging, and I think part of the reason for the show, is community. I think part of the reason for the show is solidarity. I think part of the reason we spend this time together is so we understand that we're not alone, that there are human beings in our country who value democracy, that we're not going to give up, that we are going to work together at it, that we're going to take a longer view. And I recognize I hope it's a little therapeutic. And while I do think it can be a chance and is a chance to vent some of our anger, and I know Rush Limbaugh built a media movement that informed the development of Fox News and built it around the plurality, the majority of emotions, which is essentially anger, fear, contempt, and disgust, and demonstrated to Rupert Murdoch that if you had that kind of, if you built an audience, mostly an older, mostly a white audience around anger, fear, contempt, and disgust, and also did some things with production value and the GAM-CAM, that you could get significant ratings, not a majority of the country, but enough ratings to beat out some other stuff that's, not using that same emotional palette. And I recognize it's an important emotional power, that there's things we should be disgusted about. We should be disgusted there are children in cages. We should be disgusted every single day. We should have contempt for people who, for benefit of their own greed, are undermining democracy every week. We should acknowledge that fear is legitimate. Fear is legitimate for so many people in our country. Fear of being one health care emergency away from bankruptcy, being a couple paychecks away from a fiscal crisis in their own family, being racism, particular action away from losing their life. That fear is legitimate. That anger also is legitimate. We can justify our anger at the tearing down of Western liberalism, at the tearing down of this extraordinary small d democratic experiment that, for all of its evils, for all of its mistakes, is nonetheless been the best chance we've had. We can be angry about that. But we cannot only wallow in our fear, in our disgust, in our contempt, and our anger. We cannot only rely on just the darker side, legitimate sides, the darker side of our emotion. We also have to have hope. We also have to have joy. We also have to find good surprise. That's why we do the Thank You Thursday thing. Not everybody takes the bait, I get that. And one of the reasons I'm gonna keep doing it whenever I'm asked, whenever I'm given the opportunity, is so we get in a better habit. So we get in a better habit of expressing gratitude, of feeling love, that ultimately the greatest change has gotta come from love. We can be fueled sometimes by anger. We can be fueled sometimes by even contempt and disgust. We are generally not fueled very well by fear. It more often yields to freezing than to even fleeing or fighting. And the fleeing won't help us. We've got to be motivated also by love. We've got to be in this together. Helen from Belleville, Illinois, go ahead.
Yes, I hope that they start proceedings to impeach President Trump right away, because if we want to keep Russia out of our elections, we've got to impeach Trump and get him out of our way.
Thank you, Helen. Go to Jeff, who I think wants to make a similar point. Jeff, listening on X-Ray, no relation except for the station. From Portland, Oregon, go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, Jefferson, good morning. I'm thankful for you taking my call and grateful for the Thom Hartmann Show, bringing truth and knowledge to the masses for, I know it's been at least 15 years, right? And we're lucky to have you as such a capable and, to use your word, priceless fill-in when Tom's away. So thanks for what you do.
Thanks, man.
And I know you're a sports fan, so I want us to look at these last 40 years as a heavyweight championship fight. And it's the 15th and final round, and we the people, the 99%, the working and middle class, democracy itself is on the ropes. We've basically, for the most part of these last 40 years, been getting the hell beat out of us. Even when we've won, we've lost. A lot of times, at the rounds we've won, like with Bill Clinton, we got NAFTA. With Obama, we had the Merrick Garland fiasco. So we're not unlike Rocky Balboa in the first Rocky movie. And like Rocky in that last round, despite being beaten and battered, we have a chance to throw a punch that's going to turn the tables, put this criminal so-called administration on the defensive, put them on the ropes. And that punch is an impeachment inquiry, Jefferson. So I'm urging everyone to call Speaker Pelosi's office. The longer we leave this criminal in the White House, the more we appease him, the more emboldened he gets, the more energized his base gets. And we're playing with fire when 2020 approaches.
Steve, Jeff, excuse me, I appreciate so much your call. We're going to break. I want to offer another analogy, and that is trench warfare. And I'll explain that after the break. And also offer a video, offer an audio clip as well of a member of Congress responding to your question. We'll offer that and more right after this. This is Tom Show.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Would impeachment be a knockout blow? Is that the next smart step? We'll be talking about that after the break.
It's
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study by Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. This is from the introduction. It starts with love, exchange, fellowship. It ends as it begins, in motion, in between various modes of being and belonging, and on the way to new economies of giving, taking, being with and for. And it ends with a ride in a Buick Skylark on a way to another place altogether. Surprising, perhaps, after we have engaged dispossession, debt, dislocation, and violence, but not surprising when you have understood that the projects of fugitive planning and black study are mostly about reaching out to find connection. They are about making common cause with the brokenness of being, a brokenness, I would venture to say, that is also blackness, that remains blackness, and will, despite all, remain broken, because this book is not a prescription for repair. If we do not seek to fix what has been broken, then what? How do we resolve to live with brokenness, with being broke, which is also what Moten and Harney called debt? Well, given that debt is sometimes a history of giving, at other times a history of taking, at all times a history of capitalism, and given that debt also signifies a promise of ownership but never delivers on that promise, we have to understand that debt is something that cannot be paid off. Debt, as Harney puts it, presumes a kind of individualized realization to a naturalized economy that is predicated upon exploitation. Can we have, he asks, another sense of what is owed that does not presume a nexus of activities like recognition and acknowledgement, payment and gratitude? Can debt become a principle of elaboration? Moten links economic debt to the brokenness of being in the interview with Stefan Shukatis, who he acknowledges that some debts should be paid and that much is owed, especially to black people, by white people. And yet he says, I also know that it is, that what it is that is supposed to be repaired is irreparable. It can't be repaired. The only thing we can do is tear this stuff down completely and build something new, end of quote. The Undercommons do not come to pay their debts, to repair what has been broken, to fix what has been undone. If you want to know what the Undercommons wants, what Moten and Harney want, what black people, indigenous people, queers, and poor people want, what we, the we who cohabit in the space of the Undercommons, want, it is this. We cannot be satisfied with the recognition and acknowledgement generated by the very system that denies A, that anything was ever broken, and B, that we deserve to be the broken part. So we refuse to ask for recognition, and instead we want to take apart, dismantle, tear down that structure right now. That right now limits our ability to find each other, to see beyond it, and to access the places that we know live outside its walls. We cannot say what new structures will replace the ones we live with yet, because once we have torn stuff down, we will inevitably see more and see differently and feel a new sense of wanting and being and becoming. What we want after the break will be different from what we think we want before the break, and both are necessarily different from the desires that issue from being in the dark. Let's come at this by another path. In the melancholic and visionary 2009 film version of Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, 1963, Max, the small seeker who leaves his room, his home, his family to find the world beyond, finds a world of lost and lonely beasts, and they promptly make him their king. Max is the first king the wild things have had, whom they did not eat, and who did not, in turn, try to eat them. And the beasts are the first grown things that Max has met, who want his opinion, his judgment, and his rule. Max's power is that he is small while they are big. He promises the beasts that he has no plans to eat them, and that this is more than anyone has ever promised them. He promises them that he will find ways through and around, and will slip through the cracks and re-crack the cracks if they fill up. He promises to keep sadness at bay and to make the world with the wild creatures that roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. That Max fails to make the wild things happy or to save them or to make the world with them is less important than the fact that he found them and he recognized in them the end of something and potentially the path to an alternative in his world, or an alternative to his world, excuse me. The wild things were not the utopian creatures of fairy tales. They were the rejected and lost subjects of the world Max had left behind. And because he shuttles between the Oedipal land where his mother rules and the ruined world of the wild, he knows the parameters of the real. He sees what is included and what is left out, and he is now able to set sail for another place, a place that is neither the home he left nor the home to which he wants to return. Moten and Harney want to gesture to another place, a wild place that is not simply the leftover space that limbs real and regulated zones of polite society. Rather, it is a wild place that continuously produces its own unregulated wilderness. The zone we enter through Moten and Harney is ongoing and exists in the present, and as Harney puts it, some kind of demand is already being enacted, fulfilled in the call itself. While describing the riots of London in 2011, Harney suggests that the riots and insurrections do not separate out the request, the demand, and the call. Rather, they enact the one in the other. The book is The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Howdy, everybody. I'm Jefferson Smith. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. Glad to be with you. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks so much for being so nice to me. Got a question from Jim Check. First, he says some nice things. Thank you very much for those nice things. There's what I believe is lacking in 28 CFR 600. That is the Code of Federal Regulations establishing the special counsel. Again, the special counsel regulations is a section providing for the special counsel to communicate directly with members of Congress, perhaps select committees in both the House and the Senate. The current code allows an attorney general like Bill Barr to shield the president by redaction. As we saw, that report got heavily redacted. His question: would a provision allowing members of Congress access to the unredacted report be constitutional, or would this involve the separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches? Here is my answer. So could Congress have a statute that said, no, Congress get to see the whole thing? Would that be a violation of separation of powers? Again, want to tread humbly without having done a lot of research, so I will offer my opening hypothesis from which I would research beyond if I were the one who our polity was relying upon to provide a final answer. But here's where I would start. Of course, it'd be hard to pass such a thing with the current Senate. Got to change that Senate. But let's say that happened. I think it would be constitutional to have a different special counsel set of regulations or statute. We had an independent counsel statute. That independent counsel statute could presumably have said Congress get to find out about it. Now, I could imagine at least two limitations to that, even if Congress were successfully to pass such a statute. One limitation would be some other national security provision in some other statute that would either supersede it or would arguably supersede it. So therefore, if you say, well, you can't redact anything, you got to give everything to Congress, and you found, no, there's this other statute that says this kind of thing doesn't get to be seen by other folks. There would then be a conflict of laws. There would then be something that some court would have to respond to. There might be another concern, as you have raised, and that concern would be if we saw a habit or even just the risk of Congress being abusive with this power, of saying, hey, we're going to go investigate you and we're going to look at everything that happens and then we're going to release everything that happens to the public. That could be viewed independently, separate and apart from what another statute might say, might be viewed as a separation of powers issue. My guess is, though, as a general matter, I think you could have a statute that required pretty close to unredacted reports being given to select committees. That doesn't fix everything. Lawrence Tribe, who was not complimentary of Mueller yesterday, Lawrence Tribe, Harvard law professor, my constitutional law professor, I remember still how he opened and closed our constitutional law class. So the very first day, his very opening lecture, and what he said at the end. And he opened it by telling the story of Oedipus, telling the story of Ulysses, tying himself to the mast so as not to crash his ship based on the siren song of the sirens across the rocks. And what the Constitution was supposed to do is hold us steady to key values and principles of law and morality, of operation of our democracy, even if at certain moments it is ever so tempting to follow the song and crash upon the rocks. At the very end, spoiler alert for anybody who takes this class, At the very end of that course, months later, he finished it by saying, what we have learned is there is no mast and there are no ropes. That ultimately the only thing protecting democracy is us, because we can get around that stuff. No matter what process you build, there has to be some commitment to the idea that we're stronger together than we are apart. There has to be some commitment to the idea that we should work based on principle, based on reason, based on shared values, based on a commitment to democracy. Because otherwise, any system can be subverted. Some a little more easily, some a little harder, but ultimately there is no mast and there are no ropes, and we can crash the ship of state onto the rocks. Let's go to Tracy, Free Speech TV. Go ahead, Tracy. Tracy, you there? Can't hear Tracy. Let's go to Steve from McLean, Virginia.
Hey.
Hi, Steve.
Hello?
I'm here.
Yeah, I am relatively new to this process. I learn a lot from the show. I don't think the show skips a beat when you sub for Tom, by the way.
Thanks, man.
And what I want to talk about is basically talking to the other side. And I do not want to use the weapons they use. A lot of the words, and I put a lot of this on Rush Limbaugh. At one point, I'd read on the internet that he was telling people, I don't think we should kill all liberals. We should keep some alive so we remember where they came from. That is over the top. That type of thing is over the top. And I don't want to do that. But I think we can have an impact, often by going into places where we're in the minority. And I like to try to keep putting the truth out there. And a lot of times that might mean on websites is to put out links to support what I'm saying. In terms of the posts and things like that. And I do not want to react. Sometimes I've talked, sometimes when I work out in a sauna, some of the people, we have political conversations there. And one person I consider him a friend, but we disagree politically. And I remember one time he was complaining about something that De Niro had said about Trump, and I don't even know what the heck it was. I tried to find it, I couldn't find it. And I finally said to him, well, if you don't like what he says, just boycott his movies. But he kept on doing that. So then I repeated what Trump had said at one of his rallies about paying the guy's medical bills. And I just kind of put that in his face and said, yeah, that's what Trump did. He said that. I don't think the guy knew that or not, but he was taken aback by that, and that kind of killed that conversation. Anyway, that's all the... I'm sorry.
No, finish your thought.
I just want to say also I did call in today to my congressman to support an impeachment inquiry, and that's not something I take lightly, doing that, frankly.
I appreciate that, Steve, and I do want to get to it. I was just in Wyoming. Drove through Yellowstone, went to a family reunion, the Taggart family reunion. And the Taggart family is a rural Christian, rural Mormon family. I don't know many Taggarts. I grew up as, I didn't. I went with my dad, who wanted to see his second cousin, or maybe first cousin once removed, who he had babysat when she was 4, and he is now a widower, and so I spent the weekend with my dad, and we drove to Wyoming, and we went to Cowley Days, which was the celebration of Cowley. Cowley is a town, let's call it a town, with a stated population of 635 people. They insist that it's closer to 1,000 because they've had a recent population boomlet. There have been hundreds of people who've moved to Cowley since that sign was made. An interesting conversation with the people who I was staying with, and we were sitting down having a visit. Call it a visit. We had a nice visit. And early on in the conversation, she described herself as a Trump Republican. And therefore, I was introduced. I was introduced as the 2-time. I'll tell you, I was going to say this, but I'll tell you. I was introduced by somebody who's a friend and ally, but a little bit of a blowhard, who said, "Oh yeah, this is Jefferson Smith. He's a 2-time candidate for mayor on the socialist ticket in Portland." Now, I ran one time. I ran it in a nonpartisan race, and I'm a registered Democrat. But setting all that aside, this was my introduction to this woman I'm staying with. And she says, well, I'm a Trump Republican, so we better not talk about politics. And it was really interesting because there are a couple times when I don't know if she was trying to bait me. She's a perfectly polite person, but she said, well, now a white male can't play a trans character. White male can only play a white male character. Black male can only play a black male character. Trans person play, and going on some sort of, and then she started talking about political correctness. What was interesting was when I started talking to her about, well, she raised to me, she said, is homelessness a problem in Portland, or Portland, Oregon, where I live? And I said, yeah, it is. Pretty much every major metropolitan area in the country. And if you look at homelessness, and homelessness rates pretty well track the increase in housing prices and rent prices. And we're seeing that all over the country. I'd like to say we had it figured out, but we don't. And a lot of that's linked to the defunding of federal housing benefits that goes back years, goes back decades. And she says, oh yeah, we used to have those HUD projects with HUD housing. Another thing she brought up with, what she was concerned about, was dollar stores. Dollar stores were cropping up, and it was harder, and it seemed like the middle class was shrinking. And we found a bunch of places of common ground. Now, this is not me saying, oh, the best way to win the presidency is find Trump voters and change their mind. That's actually not my view. But I really appreciate your point that we should not set aside one another's humanity. Our job is harder. Our job in some respects is harder. It's so much easier to tear down a building than it is to build one up. Everybody can right now can visualize seeing a building torn down in a matter of seconds. Think about the year that it takes to plan it, another year that it takes to construct it. It's way harder to build than it is to destroy. But we have to be builders. We can have adversaries. We can identify people who are immoral, who are doing the wrong thing. We can say bad ideas are bad ideas. We can even identify some people as villains. We don't have to be only nicey nice all the time. But at our essence, we can't be destroyers. At our essence, we can't live for the purpose of vilifying others, of merely building power for ourselves. We can't use hatred as our primary tool. Our tool has to be love. Our tool has to be togetherness. We have to be in this together, and so are other people, even when we disagree.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be back. I promise I will say something about impeachment. I said I would, and I will. We'll be right back. Edward from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Ask your question.
Yes.
Edward, go ahead.
How are you, sir? Yes, how are you, sir?
Doing good.
I wish blessings upon you and your family and your generations to come. Second of all, I would like to see if you can talk to the people that you have an audience of, that we can get together as the people in Puerto Rico did just a couple of days ago, that they actually marched and asked for this governor to resign. We, the people in America, can do the same thing, march to the White House and ask this president to resign and come out of office. The other is that as a person in Pennsylvania, we have I believe, the legal right. The Commonwealth holds us accountable if we know of a child abuse and do not report it, that we can actually be arrested because of that. I ask that as a person that knows the things that are happening in Texas and what the White House is doing, the child abuse and these children being caged, I would like for me to be recognized as one that is willing to ask if I could press charges against the White House or the President of the United States as, to go to court. Let's go to court, man. I want to take you to court and be a witness to the fact that these things are being televised in our United States and abroad.
I hear you, Edward, and thank you for that call. I heard you say at least two things. One thing I heard you say is learning a lesson from Puerto Rico of not being afraid or being bold and going to the streets to demand change in leadership. The second thing I heard you say is using the courts. I'll deal with them I'll respond to them in reverse order. So in the courts, some particular things, you might have a hard time finding standing. There's also non-judiciable political questions that most courts would dodge. So I don't want to deter you, but I also want to give you false hope with respect to using the court. And that's even without me saying that ultimately the ultimate court right now has been built for the purposes of Republican power. That is why this court has been built. This court has been built to re-engage the Lochner era. This court has been built, George Will's new book, he comes out and says that we need courts. He even said in his interview, we now need courts to be more activist. He didn't use the word activist, but we or at least I didn't hear him use the word activist, but we need courts to be more engaged. Him saying we need courts to be more engaged, more willing to block the will of the people, more willing to block actions of legislative branches, which cuts exactly across the decades of argument when they were going after activist judges. Basically what they were saying, because they weren't concerned with activist judges, what they were concerned was any tool in democracy that was starting to break down white male supremacy, that was starting to break down oligarchy in the country, that was in favor of democracy over the sanctity of inherited property power, that's what this has really been about. Right now, we have a Supreme Court that's been built to preserve that. An effort that took decades. My citation, Democracy in Chains, everybody ought to read it. I do want to respond, though, to Puerto Rico piece. There are two parts of the Puerto Rico piece. First, clear evidence, clear to everybody in the country, of corruption in the government, and supermajority understanding that needed to change. Resistance by the governor to leave. And then huge outpouring in the streets. I think that could happen if Trump tried to stay in the White House when he was supposed to be removed from it. All right, folks, I'm Jefferson Smith. Let's do a speed round. Y'all been waiting patiently. Everybody let's try to, I'll use the word I was using for Bob Mueller. Let's try to truncate it. And then I promise I'll respond to the questions and the calls for impeachment. Let's start with Ivan. Ivan from Bartlett, Illinois. Speed round.
Hey, Jeff. The thing that stood out to me yesterday, it's a thorn in the side of the GOP that the Steele dossier has been proven correct insofar as the Russians hated Hillary and helped Trump win. That is a fact. And how many times did they try to discredit the Steele dossier?
They brought it up over and over again. It was like their favorite line. Bob from Folsom, California, you're on the air. Speed round.
Oh, I just had a comment about the previous black caller. Is that appropriate now?
If it's in the speed round, we can do it, but it's got to be quick.
Oh, okay. I'll try to cover it quick. I've met some black people that actually voted for Trump, and they have a common thread, which the white people who voted for Trump, they are on an 81% total, I think, and they have a common thread. They're evangelicals. And my comment is, once you become a fundamentalist, you know, like Falwell, Dobson, Swaggart, those guys, you lose the ability to reason for yourself. And that's all I have to say.
Appreciate the call so much. Laura from Linwood, Washington, you're on the air. You got another call there, but you're on the air with the Thom Hartmann Show if you want to use the speed round.
This is Michael, not Laura.
Oh, Michael. Well, maybe Laura's calling you.
The thing is that after what we saw yesterday, it is imperative to go forth with impeachment because there's a lot of crimes here. And if you cannot indict a sitting president, which is just a policy, it's not a law. There's no law forbidding that. I don't know what other remedy to go forth. You know what I'm saying? I mean, Russians are still trying to hack into our elections, and we got to take action and hold these Senate Republicans accountable, too.
I hear you loud and clear, Michael. Now we're going to try going to Laura from Linwood, Washington, who might have been just calling Michael.
I don't know. This is Laura from Linwood, Washington.
Hello, Laura. I don't know either.
There's so many fires to put out. It makes me crazy. And my mother was very political, and I thank her for that because she's taught me to listen and think about what I can do to make this world better. And we have two main targets. One, the presidency, but I think our biggest target is because I think the presidency is going to get taken care of. I give money to people that are running, and I think, gee, I can wait on that because when we do pick the one, I'm going to vote for a Democrat. But the Senate is what is just destroying us, and I want to know, where can I send the $27 that I usually send to Bernie to help
if you got
the people
if you
that
got
are
27
running for the Senate?
If you got $27, I'll go you one better, or at least one below. Is I would focus on state legislative races because this is the most important. One could argue the most important in the history of the country. Most important set of state legislative elections in the history of the country, because at the very least, in the next decade. Because after this, there will be a census, and after that will be redistricting, and it'll be legislatures who, plus some governors, plus some secretaries of state, who draw those lines. What I will do tomorrow, I'll get into that. I'll also tweet something out about key Senate races and key legislative races, but I'm about to violate speed round, so let me get to Brian. Brian, go ahead.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks for taking my call. Many of your callers have already sort of mentioned this briefly, but I would like to ask the direct question, and that is, are there impeachable, indictable offenses committed by the president that are not in the Mueller report? In other words, the emoluments clauses.
If there were a U.S. Senate who determined that the answer to the question is almost certainly if there were a Senate who would take it up. And because he didn't you heard it, well, that's beyond my purview. Any number of financial crimes committed by this president were not covered by the Mueller report. But I'll offer that thought in my last 1 minute. But Tracy, you get to be the last in the speed round. Tracy from White Crystal Beach, Maryland.
Yes, hi. Thanks, Jefferson, for taking my call. You do a great job in Tom's absence. You just pointed out the legislative races. I was going to say that, so I won't comment. I'll look for your great information coming up tomorrow. But there's 20 Senate races or seats up for grabs and 3 people retiring in the GOP, so that should be the focus. And the other, and I'll take this offline, but the other thing I think, other than the impeachment process, and I know that the Intelligence Committee is still gathering information, I don't think there should be a rush to judgment on that, but I do think that's the focus should be on shoring up the voter registration and anything having to do with voting. So I'll take your comment offline.
My comment is that Tracy's a genius, and everybody should listen to Tracy and everything she ever says for the rest of her life. I totally agree with everything you just said, and that's my response. We're about to wrap. Let me say this. First of all, thank you. I'll be back tomorrow. We'll offer some of my thoughts about not only the coming presidential election, but maybe more importantly, the elections where I think we can have the biggest impact, and the biggest impact for the long game. We had a caller earlier who likened to Rocky and said that, well, we've got to do the knockout punch of impeachment. Didn't get to a clip that we'll try to play tomorrow about one member of Congress who essentially said, well, I want to make sure that there really is a knockout punch. She didn't use that word. I want to wait until we don't just get him on some little thing, we get him on the full thing. So I'm going to wait until we have the strongest possible case because we only have one chance. She took the knockout blow approach. I view this a little bit more like trench warfare. I think that I'd like to think of it as a building pursuit, but regardless, I see it as a long game. And to me, I see impeachment through that lens. To me, the best argument in favor of impeachment is morality, is what's right. It's not a political argument. It's not a warfare argument. It's not a sport or a game argument, but is what is the definition of a high crime misdemeanor? That, to me, is how the question should be answered. Tomorrow, though, let's talk about the fight. Let's talk about what we have to build. My last thought is you're priceless. Definition of priceless, worth a lot, not for sale. With you, we got a chance. Thank you so much for giving me and giving this community some of your time. We'll share some more of it tomorrow. I'm Jefferson Smith, and thank you, democracy.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.